the real Dracula, Vlad the Impaler's brutal war against the Ottoman Empire. The winter of 1462 was unusually bitter in Wallachia, a small principality in what is now southern Romania. As Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II led his army through mountain passes toward the capital, he and his men witnessed a sight that would be recorded in both Turkish and Byzantine chronicles: a forest of stakes stretching for miles, upon which were impaled thousands of Ottoman prisoners and Wallachian criminals. At the center, on a higher stake than the others, was the corpse of a Turkish official, positioned according to his rank. This macabre spectacle was the signature of one man, Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, known to history by the Romanian title Thebes, meaning Impaler, and to millions today simply as Dracula. Long before Bram Stoker borrowed his patronymic for a fictional vampire count, the historical Dracula had cemented his reputation as one of history's most terrifying figures. Yet behind the Gothic horror lies a more complex story of a minor Christian prince caught between empires who deployed theatrical brutality as psychological warfare against a vastly superior military force. At a time when a resurgent Ottoman Empire threatened to overwhelm southeastern Europe following the fall of Constantinople, Vlad's resistance represented one of the few successful stands against Turkish expansion. His methods were monstrous, but his impact was significant, buying crucial time for Christian Europe against the Ottoman advance. The man who would become synonymous with extreme cruelty was born in 1431 in the fortress town of Sighișoara, Transylvania. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military order formed to defend Europe against the Ottoman Turks. The name Dracula means dragon in Old Romanian, and Dracula simply means son of Dracula, a patronymic rather than a title. Young Vlad's childhood was shaped by the dangerous geopolitics of the region. Wallachia existed in a precarious position between three competing powers: the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the northwest, and Moldavia to the northeast. As a small principality unable to match these powers militarily, Wallachia survived through a combination of tribute payments, shifting alliances, and political maneuvering. In 1442, Vlad's father made a fateful decision. Summoned to a diplomatic meeting by Ottoman Sultan Murad II, he brought along his two young sons, Vlad III and Radu. The meeting was a trap. The elder Vlad was released, but his sons were taken hostage to ensure their father's loyalty to the Ottoman court. Vlad III was approximately 11 years old when he began what would be 6 years of captivity. This period of Ottoman captivity profoundly shaped the future ruler. Vlad learned Turkish, Persian, and the Quran. He observed Ottoman military tactics and administrative systems up close. He also witnessed Ottoman methods of punishment and intimidation, including impalement, which was used to execute criminals and rebels throughout the empire. While Vlad's younger brother Radu thrived in Ottoman captivity, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a close companion to the future Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad himself grew increasingly bitter and resentful. Contemporary accounts suggest he was frequently punished for his defiance and insolence toward his captors, possible early indications of the fierce pride and cruel temperament he would later display as ruler. In 1447, while Vlad remained in Ottoman hands, his father and eldest brother were murdered during a political coup backed by Hungarian forces. The elder Vlad was reportedly buried alive, while his eldest son was blinded with hot irons before being buried alongside his father. These brutal deaths would give the young hostage additional motivation for his later vengeance. Vlad was released from captivity in 1448 after his father's successor died. With Ottoman support, the 17-year-old claimed the Wallachian throne, the first of 3 separate reigns that would be interrupted by exile and imprisonment. This initial rule lasted only 2 months before Hungarian forces drove him out, sending him into exile first in Moldavia and then in Transylvania. It wasn't until 1456 that Vlad secured the Wallachian throne for his most significant and notorious reign. Moving quickly to consolidate power, he invited dozens of boyars, Wallachian nobles, to an Easter feast. Many of these nobles had been involved in the political instability of previous decades, including the coup that killed his father and brother. Vlad asked the assembled nobles how many princes they had seen rule during their lifetimes. When they answered, he had his soldiers seize them, then impale the older nobles immediately on stakes surrounding his palace. The younger and healthier nobles were marched 40 miles to the mountaintop castle of Poenari, where they were forced to build new fortifications until they died of exhaustion. This Easter massacre eliminated much of the troublesome noble class in a single day, terrorizing survivors into submission. Vlad replaced the traditional boyars with a new nobility loyal only to him, often men of humble origins who owed their new status entirely to his favor. With internal opposition eliminated, Vlad turned to Wallachia's external threats, particularly the Ottoman Empire. In 1459, Ottoman envoys arrived in Targovishte, Vlad's capital, demanding the tribute payment that Wallachia had been making to the Sublime Porte for decades. According to contemporary accounts, when the envoys refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing a religious exemption, the prince had the turbans nailed to their heads so they would never have to remove them again. This gruesome diplomatic incident marked Vlad's break with Ottoman authority. He launched a series of raids across the Danube into Ottoman territory, impaling Turkish prisoners and burning settlements. These raids, while militarily insignificant, were provocations that Vlad knew would eventually trigger a major Ottoman response, a response he was meticulously preparing to meet. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople just a few years earlier in 1453, could not allow such defiance to go unpunished. In the spring of 1462, he personally led a massive invasion force. Contemporary sources suggest as many as 100,000 men, though modern historians estimate a more likely figure of 30,000 to 60,000. Either way, the Ottoman force vastly outnumbered Vlad's army of perhaps 30,000. Facing these overwhelming odds, Vlad implemented a scorched earth policy, poisoning wells, burning crops, and driving livestock away from the Ottoman army's path. He deployed guerrilla tactics, night raids, ambushes, and psychological warfare to disrupt and demoralize the larger force. The most famous of these psychological operations was Vlad's night attack on the Ottoman camp on June 17, 1462. With a small force of a few thousand cavalry, he infiltrated the Turkish encampment in darkness, aiming to assassinate Sultan Mehmed himself. The Sultan escaped, but thousands of Ottoman soldiers were killed in the chaotic night fighting, with the Wallachians creating confusion by speaking Turkish phrases they had learned during their preparation. This daring raid, while failing in its primary objective, succeeded in unnerving the Ottoman forces. Combined with the difficulty of supplying a large army in devastated territory, and the psychological impact of encountering thousands of impaled corpses along their route, Mehmed's advance faltered. The Sultan eventually captured Targovishte, but found it abandoned with another forest of stakes outside its walls. With supply lines stretched and the Wallachian army still intact in the mountains, Mehmed withdrew, leaving a smaller force under Radu, Vlad's brother, to continue the campaign. Vlad's resistance might have been entirely successful had he not also faced opposition from Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, who had been provided with forged letters suggesting Vlad had offered loyalty to the Ottomans. When Vlad traveled to meet with Corvinus to explain the situation, he was imprisoned instead, remaining in Hungarian captivity for over a decade. During Vlad's imprisonment, Ottoman-backed Radu took control of Wallachia. Vlad's reputation in Western Europe, meanwhile, was shaped by printed pamphlets that described his atrocities in lurid detail. These early examples of mass media portrayed him as a bloodthirsty tyrant who impaled his enemies, boiled them alive, forced cannibalism among his victims, and nailed turbans to ambassadors' heads. They also described his justice, stories of how he placed a golden cup in a public square that anyone could drink from but no one dared steal, how he burned alive the idle poor and impaled dishonest merchants. Many of these accounts came from Saxon merchants who had experienced Vlad's harsh commercial policies firsthand. Vlad had restricted their trade privileges in Wallachia, favoring local merchants instead, and had impaled many who violated his strict laws. Their accounts, while based on real events, were undoubtedly exaggerated for political effect, helping justify Hungary's imprisonment of a leader who had actually been fighting their common Ottoman enemy. Vlad was released from captivity around 1474 after converting from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism and marrying a member of the Hungarian royal family. With Hungarian backing, he reclaimed the Wallachian throne briefly in 1476, but was killed in battle later that year, either by Ottoman forces or treacherous Wallachian boyars. Some accounts claim his head was preserved in honey and presented to Sultan Mehmed II, who had it displayed on a stake in Constantinople. The real Vlad's historical significance lies not in fictional vampire tales, but in his role as a buffer against Ottoman expansion. His resistance, while ultimately unsuccessful in preventing Ottoman influence in Wallachia, helped slow the Turkish advance into Central Europe. The Ottoman army that might have pressed further into Hungary spent crucial time and resources dealing with Vlad's fierce resistance and unconventional tactics. His methods, particularly impalement, deserve examination beyond simple horror. While undeniably cruel by any standard, Vlad's use of impalement was strategic rather than merely sadistic. Impalement was an exceptionally painful and prolonged death. Victims could sometimes suffer for days before expiring. The height of the stake often corresponded to the victim's social status, creating a grotesque social hierarchy even in death. By adopting this Ottoman punishment and implementing it on an unprecedented scale, Vlad created a psychological weapon that undermined Ottoman morale. Turkish soldiers, familiar with impalement as a punishment for failure, faced the prospect of this dreaded fate if captured. The forests of stakes were carefully arranged for maximum visibility, creating a form of psychological warfare that partially offset Wallachia's military disadvantage. Vlad's domestic rule, while extraordinarily harsh, also established order in a principality that had seen frequent changes of leadership and endemic corruption. Contemporary accounts describe how he targeted not only political opponents, but also criminals, idle nobles, dishonest merchants, and adulterous women. While these policies were implemented with excessive cruelty, they apparently succeeded in reducing crime. The famous story of the golden cup left in the town square supposedly untouched despite its value because people feared Vlad's punishment for theft, may be apocryphal, but it reflects the order he established through terror. In Romania, perceptions of Vlad differ dramatically from his Western vampire image. Since the 19th century, Romanian nationalism has portrayed him as a harsh but just ruler who defended national independence against Ottoman encroachment. Communist-era historiography particularly emphasized his centralization of authority and opposition to the boyar nobility, casting him as a forerunner of revolutionary leadership. Modern Romania continues to recognize Vlad as a national hero, with statues, street names, and a flourishing tourist industry centered on Dracula's castle, although the castle marketed to tourists at Bran had minimal historical connection to Vlad himself. This positive view coexists uneasily with the Western popular culture version of Dracula, creating a unique case of historical identity divided between a national hero and a fictional monster. The transformation of the historical Vlad into the fictional Count Dracula began with Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. Stoker, who never visited Romania, drew on Victorian travel books and Hungarian sources that emphasized Vlad's cruelty. The fictional Dracula retained little from the historical figure beyond the name and a general sense of menace. But the association permanently linked the medieval Wallachian prince with vampirism in Western imagination. This fictional overlay has obscured Vlad's complex historical role. He was neither the inhuman monster of Western pamphlets nor the perfect national hero of Romanian tradition. Instead, he was a medieval ruler, operating within the brutal power politics of a frontier region caught between empires. His extreme methods reflected both the desperate military situation he faced and the unstable internal politics of Wallachia after decades of weak rule. What makes Vlad particularly fascinating is how he weaponized cruelty itself. In an era of routine violence, when execution was public spectacle throughout Europe, Vlad elevated cruelty to a strategic and administrative principle. His calculated use of terror represented a response to asymmetric warfare, a small state using psychological operations to counter a militarily superior enemy. Historians continue to debate the true extent of Vlad's atrocities. German, Russian, and Turkish chronicles suggest he was responsible for 40,000 to 100,000 deaths through impalement and other methods. Modern scholars generally view these numbers as exaggerated, but agree that the scale of executions was unprecedented enough to shock even 15th century sensibilities. Archaeological evidence offers limited but disturbing confirmation of mass executions. A 2009 excavation at a site believed to be Vlad's primary killing field near Targovishche's royal court unearthed multiple mass graves containing skeletons with signs of violence, though not specifically impalement, which leaves few skeletal markers. Beyond the historical reality lies the enduring cultural impact of the Dracula mythology. The transformation of a medieval Wallachian prince into the world's most famous vampire represents one of history's most remarkable posthumous image transformations. This fictional overlay, while obscuring historical understanding, has paradoxically ensured Vlad's immortality in cultural memory. The real story of Vlad the Impaler, the desperate resistance of a small state against imperial expansion, the strategic use of theatrical cruelty as psychological warfare, the establishment of order through terror, offers insights more nuanced than either vampire tales or nationalist hagiographies suggest. In the ambiguous space between hero and monster, between defender and tyrant, stands a historical figure whose methods were as extreme as the threats he faced. a ruler who turned cruelty itself into a weapon against an empire that might otherwise have swallowed his nation without trace. The Manhattan Project's ethical dilemma. Scientists who built the bomb. The desert dawn breaks over Alamogordo, New Mexico, July 16, 1945. In the pre-dawn darkness, a group of the world's most brilliant physicists stare anxiously at a metal tower in the distance. Atop it sits the Gadget, their creation, the culmination of years of frantic work, unprecedented government funding, and the most closely guarded secret of World War II. At precisely 5:29 a.m., the world changes forever. An otherworldly light, brighter than 1,000 suns, illuminates the desert. A massive fireball rises, forming the now iconic mushroom cloud. The blast wave reaches the observers, followed by a thunderous roar. In that moment, humankind crosses a threshold from which there is no return. The atomic age has begun. Watching from a bunker 10 miles away, J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, recalls a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His colleague, physicist Kenneth Bainbridge, turns to him with a more prosaic assessment. "Now we're all sons of bitches." This is not merely the story of a weapons creation. It's a profound human drama, one that forced some of history's greatest scientific minds to confront questions about responsibility, morality, and the very purpose of knowledge itself. These men and women who had spent their lives pursuing the elegant truths of the physical universe now found themselves creating the most destructive force ever wielded by humankind. The path to Alamogordo began not in America, but in Europe in the late 1930s. In December 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, the process by which uranium atoms, when bombarded with neutrons, split into lighter elements while releasing enormous energy. Hahn's former colleague, the brilliant Jewish physicist Lise Meitner, provided the theoretical explanation from her exile in Sweden, having fled Nazi Germany. The implications were immediately apparent to physicists worldwide. If a fission reaction could be sustained and multiplied, a chain reaction, the energy released would be unprecedented. It could power cities or destroy them. In August 1939, concerns that Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon prompted Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard to draft a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning him of the danger. Szilard persuaded Albert Einstein, by then the world's most famous scientist, to sign it. The Einstein-Szilard letter emphasized that extremely powerful bombs of a new type might be constructed, and that Germany had already stopped the sale of uranium from Czech mines it controlled. Roosevelt's response was initially modest, a small committee to investigate the possibility. But as the scientific case for an atomic bomb became stronger and World War II engulfed Europe, this cautious approach transformed into the largest secret scientific undertaking in history, the Manhattan Project. By 1942, the project was placed under the leadership of General Leslie Groves, a hard-driving Army engineer who had just completed construction of the Pentagon. For scientific direction, he selected J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from the University of California, Berkeley. It was an unlikely choice. Oppenheimer had no Nobel Prize, limited administrative experience, and a background that included associations with left-wing organizations that would have normally disqualified him from sensitive work. Yet Groves recognized in Oppenheimer something extraordinary, a brilliant scientific mind coupled with Renaissance man breadth. Oppenheimer spoke 8 languages, quoted the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit, and possessed the rare ability to understand and integrate multiple scientific disciplines. His colleagues called him Oppie, and despite initial reservations about his selection, he would prove himself one of history's great scientific leaders. Oppenheimer recognized that building an atomic bomb would require bringing together the finest scientific minds in an environment where they could collaborate intensively. He proposed creating a centralized laboratory in an isolated location. The site chosen was Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote mesa in the Jemez Mountains that had previously housed a small boys' ranch school. Into this isolated setting came an extraordinary collection of intellect: Nobel laureates Enrico Fermi, James Chadwick, and Niels Bohr, future Nobelists Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Glenn Seaborg, and others. Brilliant minds like Edward Teller, John von Neumann, and Leo Szilard. Many were European refugees who had fled fascism, bringing with them not just scientific brilliance, but a profound understanding of what was at stake in the fight against Nazism. Life at Los Alamos was a strange mix of the mundane and the monumental. Scientists lived in hastily constructed housing with their families, dealing with constant shortages and isolation. They square danced in the evenings and held seminars during the day where they grappled with the most advanced physics problems ever confronted. Their children attended schools on site, playing in the same desert where their parents were creating history's most destructive weapon. Security was omnipresent. The scientists used pseudonyms when traveling. All mail was censored. Even their children couldn't know the purpose of the installation. One scientist's daughter recalled believing her father was working on a new kind of stove because he had once absent-mindedly mentioned the furnace at dinner. The work itself presented unprecedented scientific and engineering challenges. 2 distinct approaches to creating a nuclear weapon emerged. The first, called gun type, would shoot one mass of uranium into another to create a supercritical mass. The second, called implosion, would use precisely timed conventional explosives to compress a plutonium core, increasing its density until it reached criticality. Each approach required solving problems at the very frontier of physics, chemistry, and engineering. How to enrich enough uranium-235 from naturally occurring uranium. How to produce plutonium, an element that didn't exist in nature. How to design explosive lenses that would create a perfectly symmetrical implosion. The solutions demanded theoretical breakthroughs, new experimental techniques, and engineering innovations on a scale and timeline that would have seemed impossible before the war. While scientists labored at Los Alamos, enormous industrial facilities were constructed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, to produce the needed uranium and plutonium. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed 125,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, equivalent to about $29 billion today. Yet due to strict compartmentalization, most workers had no idea they were helping build an atomic bomb. Throughout this frantic work, the ethical questions lurked in the background. Many scientists had initially joined the project because they feared Nazi Germany would develop an atomic bomb first. Hitler's Germany had been the first to split the atom, had some of the world's finest physicists, and possessed uranium sources. The prospect of Hitler with nuclear weapons was genuinely terrifying. But by late 1944, as Germany's defeat became inevitable, the initial moral imperative began to shift. German atomic efforts had made little progress, as the Allies would discover after the war. The new enemy was Japan, which had no significant nuclear program. Some scientists began to question whether using the bomb was still justified. In June 1945, as preparations for the Trinity test, the first nuclear detonation, neared completion, a group of scientists led by Leo Szilard circulated a petition urging President Truman to consider demonstrating the bomb before using it against Japan. The Frank Report, prepared by several Manhattan Project scientists, similarly argued for a demonstration and warned about the consequences of using the weapon without warning. These concerns never reached Truman. General Groves ensured the petitions were delayed, and the interim committee, advising on the bomb's use, including Oppenheimer, ultimately recommended direct military use without prior demonstration. The scientific objections were marginalized as the momentum toward using the weapon became unstoppable. The Trinity test on July 16, 1945, exceeded all expectations. The yield, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, was greater than predicted. The awesome power shocked even those who had designed it. Oppenheimer's famous quote about becoming "death, destroyer of worlds" captured the moment's existential weight. Less than a month later, on August 6, 1945, a uranium bomb called Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, killing approximately 80,000 people instantly, and tens of thousands more from radiation and injuries in the following weeks. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb called Fat Man devastated Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 immediately, and many more afterward. Japan surrendered on August 15th, ending World War II. For the scientists, Trinity and the subsequent bombings forced a reckoning with the consequences of their work. Their reactions varied dramatically. Edward Teller, who would later champion the hydrogen bomb, recalled feeling proud of the technical achievement. Others were deeply troubled. Kenneth Bainbridge, who supervised the Trinity test, later wrote, "I believe the bombing of Nagasaki was a war crime. I am not proud of what we did." Robert Wilson, another physicist at Los Alamos, expressed the ambivalence many felt. The impact of the bomb on civilization was more important than our scientific fun in making it, and yet it was the scientific fun that had driven us to do it. The post-war period brought further ethical complications. Many Manhattan Project scientists became advocates for international control of atomic energy and against nuclear weapons proliferation. They formed the Federation of Atomic Scientists and published the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, featuring the famous Doomsday Clock, indicating how close humanity was to nuclear self-destruction. Oppenheimer himself became chair of the General Advisory Committee to the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission. In this role, he opposed the crash program to develop the hydrogen bomb, a weapon thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. For this stance, and because of his pre-war left-wing associations, he became a target during the McCarthy era. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked after a hearing widely considered a show trial, ending his government service. When told of the decision to proceed with the hydrogen bomb, despite his objections, Oppenheimer quoted himself as saying, "In some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." This sense of having known sin haunted many Manhattan Project participants. Hans Bethe, who led the theoretical division at Los Alamos, spent much of his subsequent career advocating nuclear arms control. Leo Szilard left physics entirely, turning to biology and fiction writing that explored ethical themes. Joseph Rotblat, the only scientist to leave the Manhattan Project on moral grounds when it became clear Germany wouldn't develop the bomb, helped found the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, which won the Nobel Peace Prize for nuclear disarmament efforts. What makes the Manhattan Project scientists' ethical struggle so compelling is that it represents the first time in history when scientists had to confront, in real time, the enormous destructive potential of their work. Previous scientific discoveries had been weaponized, chemistry producing poison gas, biology leading to germ warfare. But never had scientists so directly created a weapon of such unprecedented destructive power. Their dilemma raised profound questions that remain relevant today. What responsibilities do scientists have for the applications of their discoveries? When does the pursuit of knowledge need to be constrained by consideration of consequences? How should scientists respond when their work is directed toward military ends? The physicists of the Manhattan Project offered different answers. Some, like Teller, embraced the role of creating weapons they believed necessary for national security. Others, like Rotblat, drew firm ethical lines they wouldn't cross. Most fell somewhere in between, proceeding with the work while harboring doubts, then spending years afterward trying to control the forces they had unleashed. What's particularly poignant is how these brilliant minds, trained to think in terms of elegant equations and universal laws, suddenly confronted messy ethical questions with no clear answers. As Richard Feynman later recalled about watching the Trinity test, I thought only of the immediate urgency that we had felt during the war. I had no thought about what it would mean to the world in the future at that time. The world they helped create, one permanently altered by the possibility of nuclear annihilation, remains our world today. Though the Cold War has ended, 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons. The fundamental ethical questions the Manhattan Project scientists faced continue to challenge us, particularly as new technologies from genetic engineering to artificial intelligence raise similar concerns about scientific responsibility. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Manhattan Project's ethical dilemma is the recognition that science cannot be separated from its human consequences. As Oppenheimer told students at MIT in 1947, if you are a scientist, you believe that it is good to find out how the world works, that it is good to find out what the realities are, that it is good to turn over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world. It is not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity. The tragedy and the warning of the Manhattan Project is what happens when that power outpaces our wisdom in using it. In creating the atomic bomb, brilliant minds reach the pinnacle of scientific achievement, while simultaneously opening an abyss of potential destruction. Their struggle to reconcile these opposites, to be proud of their scientific achievement while horrified by its implications, reflects the central paradox of modern science itself. As we face new technologies with both tremendous promise and peril, the physicists who gathered in the New Mexico desert and watched their creation forever change the world offer us not answers, but a profound caution. Knowledge without ethical foresight can lead even the most brilliant minds to find themselves, like Oppenheimer, unexpectedly transformed into death, the destroyer of worlds. The Forgotten Female Pharaoh, Hatshepsut's Reinvention as a Male King. In the grand halls of Karnak Temple, around 1473 BCE, an extraordinary coronation took place. The figure ascending to the throne of Egypt wore the traditional regalia of Pharaoh, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ceremonial beard, and the royal kilt. Court officials and priests bowed in reverence to this new ruler, who took the traditional 5 royal names and proclaimed a divine right to rule as the incarnation of Horus, son of the god Amun. Yet beneath these masculine trappings of pharaonic power was Hatshepsut, a woman who had orchestrated the most successful gender transformation in ancient history to secure her position as Egypt's ruler. For over 20 years, Hatshepsut would govern one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, launching ambitious building projects, reopening trade routes, and leading Egypt through a period of peace and prosperity. Then, after her death, something remarkable happened. Her successor attempted to erase her from history entirely, chiseling her name and image from monuments across Egypt. So thoroughly was this erasure that her existence remained largely unknown until the 19th century, when archaeologists began deciphering hieroglyphics and uncovered one of history's most fascinating stories of female power, gender transformation, and historical revision. To understand Hatshepsut's extraordinary rise to power, we must first understand the complex royal family dynamics of Egypt's 18th dynasty. Born a princess around 1507 BCE, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, one of Egypt's warrior kings, who had expanded the empire's boundaries into Nubia and the Levant. As was common practice in royal Egyptian families, she was married to her half-brother, Thutmose II, who became pharaoh after their father's death. This marriage was likely more political than passionate. Thutmose II was the son of a secondary wife, making his claim to the throne somewhat tenuous. Marriage to Hatshepsut, the daughter of the great queen Amos, provided crucial legitimacy. Hatshepsut thus became the great royal wife, Egypt's equivalent of a queen. But the couple produced only a daughter, Neferura, not the male heir needed to continue the royal line. Thutmose II did, however, father a son, the future Thutmose III, with a harem woman named Isis. When Thutmose II died after a relatively brief reign of about 13 years, this son was likely still a young child, perhaps only 2 or 3 years old. Too young to rule, Thutmose III was named pharaoh with Hatshepsut serving as regent, a traditional role for royal women in ancient Egypt when kings ascended the throne as minors. Here, the traditional narrative should have played out as it had many times before. The queen regent would exercise power temporarily, while ensuring her stepson received the education and training needed to assume full control of the kingdom when he came of age. Instead, Hatshepsut embarked on a carefully calculated campaign to transform herself from regent to ruler in her own right. The evidence suggests this transformation occurred gradually. In the early years of her regency, Hatshepsut fulfilled the traditional roles expected of a royal woman, serving as God's wife of Amun, an important religious position, overseeing administrative matters, and preparing her stepson for kingship. Monuments from this period depict her in feminine dress, wearing the close-fitting sheath and headdress, appropriate to her status as royal widow and regent. But around the 7th year of her regency, everything changed. Hatshepsut began to claim the full titles and regalia of pharaoh. She took the throne name Matkare, truth is the soul of Ra, and had herself depicted in the royal kilt, crown, and ceremonial beard of Egypt's kings. In temple reliefs and statuary, her figure transformed, shoulders broadened, facial features became more masculine, and feminine curves disappeared beneath male royal attire. This wasn't simply a woman dressing as a man. In the deeply religious context of ancient Egypt, The pharaoh served as the living incarnation of the god Horus and the son of Amun-Ra. For Hatshepsut to claim the throne required more than a change of clothing. It required creating an entirely new theological and political narrative that could justify a female body occupying a traditionally male divine role. Her solution was ingenious. Rather than challenge the gendered assumptions of Egyptian kingship directly, she crafted a divine origin story that transcended them. The walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari tell this tale in elaborate relief carvings, how the god Amun, taking the form of her father Thutmose, visited her mother Ahmose and fathered Hatshepsut, thereby making her the direct offspring of the divine. One inscription has Amun prophesizing, "This daughter of mine, whom I have placed in your body, she shall exercise the excellent kingship in this entire land." This divine conception narrative gave Hatshepsut a claim to the throne that theoretically superseded gender. She wasn't just any woman attempting to rule. She was the divinely appointed daughter of Amun himself. It was a masterpiece of religious and political propaganda, using Egypt's own theological system to support what was essentially a peaceful coup. Critically, Hatshepsut never removed her stepson from his position as co-ruler. Throughout her reign, Thutmose III remained technically a pharaoh, gradually assuming military responsibilities as he matured. Hatshepsut's monuments sometimes acknowledge him, and dated papyri from the period reference both rulers. This pragmatic arrangement may have helped secure the support of court officials who might otherwise have opposed her rule. With her position established, Hatshepsut launched an ambitious program of construction and restoration that would become one of her reign's defining features. Her crowning architectural achievement was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a stunning multi-tiered structure set against dramatic limestone cliffs. The temple's colonnaded design, with its harmonious proportions and integration into the natural landscape, stands among ancient Egypt's most beautiful monuments. At Karnak, the great temple complex dedicated to Amun, she erected towering obelisks, the tallest structures of their day, carved from single pieces of granite and capped with electrum, a gold-silver alloy, to catch the sun's rays. One surviving inscription boasts that the obelisks took just 7 months to quarry, transport, and erect, a remarkable feat of engineering and organization. Beyond building monuments, Hatshepsut restored temples that had fallen into disrepair and revitalized religious institutions. These actions served multiple purposes. They demonstrated her piety, created employment, and established her legitimacy through association with Egypt's sacred traditions. Perhaps the most celebrated achievement of Hatshepsut's reign was the trading expedition she dispatched to the land of Punt, likely located in present-day Somalia or Eritrea. Ancient Egypt had traded with Punt since the Old Kingdom, but these connections had lapsed until Hatshepsut re-established them. The expedition, meticulously documented on her temple walls, brought back exotic woods, incense, myrrh trees, animal skins, and even living baboons and panthers. The Punt expedition showcases Hatshepsut as a shrewd economic strategist. By securing direct access to luxury goods like frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious rituals, she enhanced both Egypt's trade position and her own standing with the powerful priesthood. The images of Punt's landscape, architecture, and people carved on her temple walls also represent one of the earliest and most detailed ethnographic records from ancient times. Throughout her approximately 22-year reign, Egypt appears to have prospered. Unlike her warrior father and her eventually militant stepson, Hatshepsut focused on peaceful economic development and construction rather than military expansion. Few military campaigns are recorded from her rule, suggesting a period of relative stability, though this may also reflect gendered expectations about which royal activities were appropriate to commemorate. The question of Hatshepsut's personal life during her reign remains intriguing but elusive. Some evidence suggests that Senenmut, her chief steward and the architect of her mortuary temple, may have been her lover. He received unprecedented privileges for a non-royal, including permission to place his image in hidden locations within her temple and a tomb near hers. Senenmut also served as tutor to her daughter Neferura, possibly being groomed as a potential successor until Neferu's apparently early death. Hatshepsut's own death, around 1458 BCE, appears to have been peaceful, possibly from bone cancer, as suggested by examination of a mummy tentatively identified as hers. She was approximately 50 years old and had ruled successfully for about 2 decades. With her passing, her stepson, Thutmose III, now a man in his early 20s, finally assumed sole control of Egypt. What happened next created one of ancient history's greatest mysteries. Sometime around the 20th year of his solo reign, approximately 2 decades after Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III began a systematic campaign to erase his stepmother from history. Her name was chiseled from monuments, her royal titulary excised from official records, her statues toppled and sometimes smashed. In some cases, her image was carefully cut from temple walls and replaced with offerings or empty space. Her obelisks were walled up, hiding them from view but not destroying these massive structures outright. This damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, was both thorough and selective. Interestingly, Thutmose didn't attempt to claim her accomplishments as his own. He simply removed her royal presence while leaving evidence of the achievements themselves. He also didn't extend this persecution to her non-royal identity. References to her as God's wife or great royal wife were often left intact. Only the Hatshepsut who had ruled as Pharaoh was systematically erased. Why would Thutmose III wait 2 decades before attempting to eradicate his stepmother from history? Early Egyptologists discovering this erasure in the 19th century assumed personal resentment, a man finally taking revenge against the woman who had usurped his rightful place on the throne. But more recent scholarship suggests a more pragmatic motive. Thutmose III had a succession problem of his own. His chief son, who would become Amenhotep II, may have faced challenges to his legitimacy. By eliminating the precedent of Hatshepsut, a ruler whose claim to the throne had circumvented traditional succession, Thutmose could strengthen his son's position. This theory helps explain the timing, as Thutmose's erasure campaign appears to have begun around when he was preparing his son to succeed him. Whatever the motive, Thutmose III's attempt to erase Hatshepsut nearly succeeded. For thousands of years, her reign remained largely unknown. When Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 sparked Western interest in ancient Egyptian civilization, Hatshepsut's existence was still a mystery. Early surveys of pharaonic chronology showed a puzzling gap where her reign should have been. It took the decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s to begin revealing her story. Even then, the extent of Hatshepsut's accomplishments and the unique nature of her rule emerged slowly, as archaeologists pieced together fragments of evidence that had survived Thutmose's purge. The decisive breakthrough came in 1903 when archaeologist Howard Carter who would later discover Tutankhamun's tomb, uncovered a hidden cache of Hatshepsut's statuary that had been deliberately buried in antiquity. These remarkably preserved sculptures, showing the female pharaoh in various stages of her transformation from queen to king, provided the first substantial visual evidence of her extraordinary reinvention. In 2007, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass identified a mummy from tomb KV60 in the Valley of the Kings as Hatshepsut herself. The identification used DNA testing and evidence from a tooth found in a canopic box bearing her name. If confirmed, this discovery completes a remarkable archaeological journey, from complete erasure to the recovery not just of her story but her physical remains. Hatshepsut's legacy extends far beyond her monuments. Her reign demonstrates the complex interaction between gender and power in the ancient world. Rather than directly challenging gendered expectations about leadership, she worked within the symbolic and religious systems of her time to create a unique position for herself, not quite woman, not entirely man, but unquestionably pharaoh. Her success in this gender transformation was so complete that when her statues were first discovered in the 19th century, archaeologists were utterly confused by the contradiction between the masculine royal insignia and the clearly female facial features and body represented in some of her early royal depictions. Some early scholars even suggested these might represent a homosexual male pharaoh, rather than accepting the simpler explanation of a female ruler. Hatshepsut's story also raises fascinating questions about how history gets written and rewritten. Had Thutmose III not attempted to erase her, she might have been remembered as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, a builder and economic innovator whose peaceful reign brought prosperity. Instead, she became a historical puzzle, her achievements only gradually reclaimed through painstaking archaeological detective work. The female pharaoh who became a king, with all the theological and political implications that transformation entailed in ancient Egypt, left a legacy literally carved in stone. Despite history's attempt to forget her, Hatshepsut's monuments endure, testament to a ruler whose vision extended beyond the gender boundaries of her time, and whose architectural achievements continue to inspire awe over 3 millennia later. The ancient Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old computer. In the spring of 1900, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera made a discovery that would challenge our entire understanding of ancient technology. Descending to the seabed, diver Elias Stadiatis spotted what appeared to be corpses among the wreckage of an ancient Roman cargo ship. These corpses turned out to be bronze statues, green with age after nearly 2 millennia underwater. When archaeologists recovered the shipwreck's contents, they discovered a treasure trove of luxury goods, marble statues, jewelry, glassware, and pottery, likely being transported from the eastern Mediterranean to Rome around 60 to 70 BC. Among these precious artifacts was a corroded lump of metal that initially attracted little attention. No one could have imagined that this unassuming object would become one of archaeology's most extraordinary finds, a mechanical computer from ancient Greece that wouldn't have technological equals until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, forces us to radically reconsider what the ancient world was capable of achieving. It reveals a level of technological sophistication that was thought impossible for its time, raising profound questions about lost knowledge and the non-linear path of human progress. How did ancient Greek scientists create a device of such complexity? What does its existence tell us about ancient technological capabilities? And perhaps most intriguingly, if this single device survived by pure chance, what other marvels might have been lost to time? The mechanism itself is a masterpiece of miniaturized gearing, a bronze astronomical calculator containing at least 30 precisely engineered bronze gears, arranged in a sophisticated differential system. About the size of a shoebox and originally encased in a wooden frame with bronze plates, it could track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predict eclipses, and even model the irregular orbit of the moon, with remarkable accuracy. When first discovered, however, none of this was apparent. The mechanism spent decades in storage at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, its significance unrecognized. It wasn't until 1951 that British physicist Derek J. de Solla Price began a serious investigation, publishing preliminary findings that suggested the object was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. But even Price couldn't fully reveal its secrets. The real breakthrough came in the early 2000s, when an international team led by Mike Edmonds and Tony Freeth used advanced imaging technology, including X-ray computed tomography and polynomial texture mapping, to peer inside the corroded fragments without damaging them. What they found astonished the scientific community. The mechanism contained a complex array of at least 30 precisely cut bronze gears, though the original may have had many more. These weren't crude approximations, but mathematically precise cogs with triangular teeth, some as small as 1.5 millimeters in size, arranged in a differential gearing system that could model complex astronomical movements. One gear contained 223 teeth, precisely reflecting the 223-month Saros cycle of eclipse prediction known to Babylonian astronomers. When operated by turning a hand crank, these interlocking gears drove at least 7 hands or pointers on the device's front and back displays. The front dial showed the position of the sun and moon in the zodiac and the phase of the moon. The back contained 2 spiral dials showing eclipse predictions and the timing of Olympic Games and other ancient Pan-Hellenic athletic competitions. Most remarkably, the mechanism contained a pin-and-slot device that modeled the moon's elliptical orbit, a sophisticated mechanical implementation of the lunar theory developed by the 17th century astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. This innovation allowed the device to account for the moon's varying speed as it moves around the Earth, displaying its position with impressive accuracy. Inscriptions revealed on the bronze plates show that the device came with an instruction manual. Written in Koine Greek, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, these texts include descriptions of astronomical phenomena, operating instructions, and labels for various features. The language and letter forms date the mechanism to approximately 100 to 150 BCE, though the ship carrying it sank somewhat later. The device's sophistication becomes even more remarkable when we consider that nothing of comparable complexity is known to have existed until the astronomical clocks built by Islamic and European craftsmen over 1,400 years later. It represents a level of technological achievement that was previously thought impossible for the ancient world. To understand how such a device could have been created, we need to consider the intellectual context of the Hellenistic period, roughly 323 to 31 BCE, when Greek culture spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean following Alexander the Great's conquests. This era saw an unprecedented flowering of scientific and mathematical inquiry centered in Alexandria, Rhodes, and other Eastern Mediterranean cities. Scholars like Archimedes, Eratosthenes, Apollonius, and Hipparchus developed sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics. Archimedes reportedly built mechanical models of the heavens, while Posidonius of Rhodes supposedly created a similar planetary model. Until the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism, however, these accounts were often treated as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Based on the style of its Greek inscriptions and astronomical alignments, experts believe the mechanism was likely created in Rhodes or possibly Syracuse around 100 to 150 BCE. Rhodes was a center of astronomical learning and mechanical engineering, home to the famous Colossus of Rhodes statue and a tradition of mechanical innovation. The mechanism's calendar features the names of months used in Corinth and its colonies, including Syracuse and Sicily, providing another potential connection. The question of who might have designed such a device inevitably leads to speculation about Archimedes of Syracuse. 287 to 212 BCE, the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity. While the mechanism was built after his death, it could represent a tradition stemming from his work. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, described a device built by Archimedes that showed the motions of the sun and moon and those 5 stars, which are called wanderers, the visible planets, which sounds remarkably similar to the Antikythera mechanism. The engineering precision required to create the mechanism's gears was previously thought beyond ancient capabilities. Modern reconstructions by experts like Michael Wright have demonstrated that the necessary tools and techniques were theoretically available, though requiring extraordinary skill. The teeth of the gears were cut with a precision that suggests the use of a sophisticated metalworking lathe and careful mathematical calculation. The mathematical knowledge embedded in the mechanism is equally impressive. The gear ratios precisely encode astronomical cycles known to Babylonian and Greek astronomers, including the Metonic cycle, 235 lunar months equaling 19 solar years, the Saros cycle of eclipse prediction, 223 lunar months, and the Exeligmos cycle, triple Saros. The pin and slot mechanism that models the moon's varying speed represents a brilliant mechanical solution to a complex mathematical problem. What's particularly fascinating is that the Antikythera mechanism represents technology that seems to have emerged fully formed, with no known precursors and few known successors. This raises the tantalizing question: how many other advanced ancient technologies might have been lost to time? Unlike stone temples or marble statues, delicate mechanical devices rarely survive archaeology's filtering process. Bronze was valuable and routinely melted down for reuse. The only reason the Antikythera mechanism survived at all is that it sank in deep water, beyond the reach of salvagers until modern times. If this single example survived by pure chance, how many similar devices might have been created in antiquity? The mechanism's existence forces us to reconsider assumptions about ancient technological capabilities and the non-linear nature of human progress. The traditional narrative suggests a steady advancement of technology, from simple to complex, with occasional setbacks. The Antikythera mechanism reveals a more complicated truth, that advanced technologies can emerge, disappear, and then need to be reinvented centuries later. The knowledge necessary to create such sophisticated astronomical computers appears to have been lost during the tumultuous period of late antiquity, as the Roman Empire fractured and eventually fell in the West. Political instability, economic decline, and changing intellectual priorities all contributed to this loss of technical knowledge. Not until the medieval Islamic Golden Age and later European Renaissance would astronomical calculators of comparable sophistication reappear. The mechanical astronomical clocks of the 14th century represent the next known examples of similar technology, nearly 1,400 years after the Antikythera mechanism. Even these later devices initially lacked some of the sophisticated features found in the ancient Greek computer. Modern research continues to reveal new details about this extraordinary artifact. A 2021 study led by Tony Freeth proposed a new reconstruction of the mechanism's front dial that would have displayed the movements of all 5 planets known to the ancients, in addition to the Sun and Moon. This would make the device a complete planetarium, capable of showing the entire known solar system's movements at the turn of a crank, a level of sophistication almost beyond comprehension for its era. Another recent discovery identified the mechanism's starting date as December 23rd, 178 BCE, corresponding to an astronomical event, a rare eclipse that would have been visible from the eastern Mediterranean. This starting date helps place the device in a specific historical context and may eventually help identify its creator. The Antikythera mechanism's significance extends beyond archaeology and history of technology. It represents a profound philosophical puzzle about human knowledge and progress. Why did such sophisticated technology apparently disappear for over a millennium? What other capabilities might ancient civilizations have possessed that we remain unaware of? How should we understand the relationship between scientific theory and technological application in the ancient world? Some scholars have suggested that ancient Greek society, with its reliance on slave labor, lacked incentives to develop practical applications of theoretical knowledge. Others point to the separation between scholars and craftsmen in the ancient world, with theoretical knowledge rarely informing practical mechanics. The Antikythera mechanism challenges both these assumptions, showing that at least in some cases advanced theoretical knowledge was applied to create sophisticated mechanical devices. The mechanism also raises questions about our understanding of ancient astronomy. The device incorporates astronomical knowledge that scholars previously believed was purely theoretical in the ancient world. Its ability to predict eclipses and model the moon's varying speed suggests a more sophisticated merger of theory and practical application than previously recognized. For modern scientists and engineers attempting to recreate the mechanism, the project offers unique challenges. Several working models have been built using different interpretations of the fragmentary evidence. The most accurate reconstructions require extraordinary precision in cutting gear teeth and calculating gear ratios, challenging even with modern tools. That ancient craftsmen achieved such precision using hand tools and mathematical calculations without digital assistance only increases our admiration for their achievement. Today, about 1/3 of the original mechanism survives, divided into 82 fragments containing traces of at least 30 gears. These pieces are housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, with accurate replicas displayed at various scientific museums worldwide. Computer visualizations allow scholars and the public to see how the complete device would have looked and functioned. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Antikythera mechanism is how it demonstrates the contingent nature of technological progress. We often assume that technology develops in a steady, linear fashion, with each innovation building upon previous ones in an unbroken chain. The The 1400-year gap between the mechanism and subsequent devices of similar complexity reminds us that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that progress is not inevitable, and that societies can forget as well as discover. In our own age of rapid technological advancement, this ancient computer offers a humbling reminder that sophisticated knowledge, once acquired, can slip away. It suggests that perhaps some ancient authors weren't exaggerating when they described remarkable technologies that seemed implausible to modern historians, and it raises the tantalizing possibility that other remarkable ancient technologies may have existed, their traces erased by time except in frustrated references by ancient authors that once seemed like mere fantasy. The Baghdad House of Wisdom. When the Islamic world led science, while Europe languished in what historians later called the Dark Ages, a brilliant light of learning burned in the East. Imagine a vast library and research center where scholars from across the known world, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Zoroastrians, gathered to translate, preserve, and expand human knowledge, where astronomy, mathematics, medicine, chemistry, zoology, geography, and philosophy flourished under generous patronage, where ancient Greek texts were not only preserved, but improved upon, laying the groundwork for the European Renaissance, centuries later. This intellectual powerhouse was the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, established in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age. At its height in the 9th century, Baghdad was the world's largest city, with a population approaching 1 million, a cosmopolitan metropolis of unprecedented wealth and cultural splendor at the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. And at the heart of Baghdad stood this remarkable institution that would transform human knowledge and plant the seeds of modern science. The story of the House of Wisdom challenges our contemporary narratives about the historical relationship between science, religion, and culture. It reveals a period when the Islamic world led global scientific advancement, when scholars of different faiths collaborated in pursuit of knowledge, and when rulers invested enormous resources in understanding the natural world. This golden age of Islamic science wasn't just a matter of preserving Greek knowledge during Europe's intellectual slumber. It was a period of remarkable original discoveries and innovations that still influence our world today. The foundations of the House of Wisdom were laid by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, whose reign from 786 to 809 CE marked the cultural zenith of the Abbasid Caliphate. Remembered in the West primarily through tales in the Arabian Nights, Harun presided over an empire stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. His Baghdad was a city of gardens, palaces, and mosques, the wealthiest and most sophisticated metropolis of its time. Unlike many rulers throughout history, Harun valued knowledge alongside military and political power. He established a library within his palace complex and began collecting books and manuscripts from across the known world. He also invited scholars to Baghdad, creating an intellectual climate that would flourish under his successors. But it was Harun's son, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, reigned 813 to 833 CE, who truly established the House of Wisdom as the medieval world's preeminent center of learning. A scholar himself, particularly interested in philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics, al-Ma'mun expanded his father's library into a major research institution. Legend has it that al-Ma'mun was inspired by a dream in which he conversed with Aristotle about the nature of goodness. Whether this story is apocryphal or not, Al-Ma'mun's fascination with Greek philosophy drove his ambitious project to translate the works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and other Greek luminaries into Arabic. To accomplish this monumental task, Al-Ma'mun dispatched emissaries to the Byzantine Empire, offering generous bounties for Greek manuscripts. He reportedly paid translators the weight of each completed book in gold. Under his patronage, the House of Wisdom became the largest repository of books in the world, with some accounts claiming it held over 400,000 volumes at its peak, a staggering number for a time when each book had to be copied by hand. The House of Wisdom wasn't merely a library, but a dynamic institution that encompassed translation, education, and original research. It featured observation equipment for astronomy, laboratories for experiments, rooms for teaching and discussion, and facilities for copying and binding books. Scholars received stipends that allowed them to focus entirely on intellectual pursuits, creating a medieval equivalent of a modern research university. What made the House of Wisdom particularly remarkable was its cosmopolitanism. Unlike many contemporary centers of learning tied to specific religious traditions, Baghdad's intellectual center welcomed scholars regardless of faith or ethnicity. Christians translated Greek philosophical texts that had been preserved in Syrian monasteries. Jewish scholars contributed medical and astronomical knowledge. Persians brought administrative expertise and literary traditions. Indians shared their mathematical innovations, including the decimal system and the concept of zero. This multiculturalism reflected the Abbasid Caliphate's position at the crossroads of civilizations and trade routes. Baghdad stood at the center of a vast network connecting China, India, Persia, Arabia, North Africa, and Europe. Ideas like goods flowed along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes, converging in the Abbasid capital. The translation movement that began under Al-Ma'mun continued for roughly 2 centuries, preserving countless works that might otherwise have been lost. This wasn't simply a matter of creating Arabic versions of Greek texts. Translators often worked in teams, with one member familiar with the original language and another skilled in producing elegant Arabic prose. They developed sophisticated techniques for handling technical vocabulary and abstract concepts, creating a scientific Arabic terminology that would serve scholars for centuries. Beyond mere preservation, House of Wisdom scholars engaged critically with these translated works, correcting errors, resolving contradictions, and expanding upon the original material. This approach reflected the Islamic intellectual tradition's emphasis on ijtihad, independent reasoning, rather than taqlid, imitation. Not just accepting inherited knowledge, but questioning and improving it. Among the most brilliant minds associated with the House of Wisdom was Al-Khwarizmi, circa 780 to 850 CE, whose name gives us the word algorithm. His book, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, introduced algebraic methods for solving quadratic equations, and gave us the word algebra from its title, Al-Jabr. His works on Indian numerals helped spread what we now call Arabic numerals throughout the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe, revolutionizing mathematics by replacing the cumbersome Roman numeral system. Another towering figure was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, 809 to 873 CE, a Nestorian Christian physician who translated over 100 works from Greek into Arabic and Syriac, particularly medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates. His precise, methodical translations and original medical treatises established standards for Arabic medical literature. Hunayn's appointment as the personal physician to the caliph, despite being Christian, demonstrates the meritocratic and multicultural nature of the Abbasid court. The polymath al-Kindi, circa 801 to 873 CE, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, wrote hundreds of works on medicine, philosophy, mathematics, optics, and music. He attempted to reconcile Greek philosophical traditions with Islamic thought, pioneered cryptography, including frequency analysis for decoding encrypted messages, and conducted groundbreaking studies in optics. Al-Jahiz, 776 to 868 CE, produced works on zoology that anticipated evolutionary concepts, noting how environmental factors influenced animal development and how animals competed for survival. His Book of Animals contains remarkably modern observations about animal adaptations and food chains. The Banu Musa brothers, Muhammad, Ahmad, and Al-Hassan, were mathematicians and engineers who wrote the Book of Ingenious Devices, documenting over 100 mechanical apparatuses, many of their own invention. Their work on automata and mechanical devices foreshadowed later developments in engineering and robotics. These examples represent just a fraction of the intellectual output associated with the House of Wisdom. Across disciplines, scholars made advances that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. In astronomy, they refined measurements of Earth's circumference, the length of the solar year, and planetary motions. They developed new instruments like the astrolabe and built sophisticated observatories. In medicine, they established the world's first hospitals with specialized wards, introduced clinical trials for testing treatments, pioneered surgical techniques, and documented thousands of drugs and their effects. In chemistry, or alchemy, they developed techniques like distillation, sublimation, and crystallization that form the foundation of modern chemical processes. The word alchemy itself comes from Arabic, alchemia, as do alcohol, alkali, and other chemical terms. In mathematics, beyond algebra and algorithms, they made advances in trigonometry, developed the sine and cosine functions, and solved complex geometrical problems. In optics, they conducted experiments on light refraction, described how the eye works, and questioned ancient Greek theories about vision. In geography, they created the most accurate world maps of their time, calculated latitudes and longitudes of major cities, and produced detailed regional surveys. The Islamic scholarly tradition emphasized empirical observation and experimentation to a degree that surpassed ancient Greek approaches, which often prioritized philosophical reasoning over testing. This empirical emphasis, combined with the mathematical tools developed in the Islamic world, laid important groundwork for what would later become the scientific method. All of this intellectual activity took place within a religious context that, contrary to modern assumptions about science-religion conflicts, generally encouraged scholarly inquiry. Many scholars cited the Quran's numerous exhortations to observe and reflect upon the natural world as motivation for their studies. Verses like, "Are the knowledgeable equal to the ignorant?" 39.9, and hadith such as, "Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim," were frequently invoked to justify scientific pursuits. Major institutions of learning were often associated with mosques, and many scholars were also religious figures. Astronomical research that helped determine prayer times and the direction of Mecca received particular support. Medical studies were valued for their practical benefits in alleviating suffering, seen as a religious duty. Mathematics found applications in calculating inheritance divisions according to Islamic law. This integration of religious and scientific worldviews didn't prevent occasional controversies, particularly around philosophical questions that seemed to challenge religious doctrines. Yet the overall intellectual climate remained remarkably open for its time, allowing significant advances across fields of knowledge. The House of Wisdom flourished for roughly 2 centuries before beginning a gradual decline. Internal political conflicts within the Abbasid Caliphate, economic challenges, and shifting intellectual attitudes all contributed to its diminishing influence. The devastating blow came in 1258 CIE, when Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. Historical accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from the thousands of books thrown into the water, a potent symbol of cultural destruction. Yet the intellectual legacy of the House of Wisdom didn't disappear with the physical institution. Centers of learning had already been established throughout the Islamic world, from Cordoba in Muslim Spain to Samarkand in Central Asia. Scholars fled Baghdad with books and knowledge, establishing or enhancing institutions elsewhere. The works produced and preserved during the Islamic Golden Age continued to influence intellectual development across 3 continents. When Europe began emerging from its intellectual slumber in the 12th century, it was largely through contact with Islamic learning centers in Spain and Sicily that ancient Greek knowledge, enhanced by centuries of Islamic scholarship, re-entered European awareness. Latin translations of Arabic works, including Arabic translations of Greek originals with added commentaries, fueled the early European Renaissance. From astronomy to medicine, mathematics to philosophy, European scholars built upon foundations laid in Baghdad and other Islamic centers of learning. Copernicus used astronomical tables developed by Islamic astronomers. Fibonacci introduced Arabic numerals to Europe after studying with Arab mathematicians in North Africa. Medical schools taught Avicenna's Canon of Medicine into the 17th century. Dante placed Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, in limbo with virtuous pagans in his Divine Comedy, acknowledging their intellectual greatness, despite religious differences. Even our language reflects this influence. Algebra, algorithm, cipher, zenith, nadir, azimuth, alcohol, alkali, elixir, and numerous star names like Aldebaran and Betelgeuse derive from Arabic terms developed or popularized during the Islamic Golden Age. The story of the House of Wisdom offers valuable lessons for our contemporary world. It demonstrates how a culture's openness to outside influences, willingness to preserve and build upon previous knowledge, and ability to gather diverse perspectives can create extraordinary intellectual flourishing. It shows that periods of scientific advancement can emerge from seemingly unlikely cultural and religious contexts. And it reminds us that the global scientific heritage belongs not to any single civilization, but represents a cumulative human achievement with contributions from many cultures. Perhaps most importantly, the House of Wisdom stands as a powerful counter-narrative to simplistic views of a perpetual clash between Islamic and Western civilizations, or between science and religion. It reveals a more complex history, in which Islamic scholars preserved and enhanced the Western classical heritage while making original contributions that would later help fuel Europe's scientific revolution. Today, as the world again grapples with cultural polarization and religious scientific tensions, the memory of Baghdad's intellectual oasis, where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked side by side translating Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics, offers an inspiring alternative vision of how different traditions can combine their insights in pursuit of understanding our world. The light of learning that burned so brightly in medieval Baghdad may have been dimmed by conquest and time, but its illumination continues to reach us, reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge transcends cultural, religious, and political boundaries, a global heritage as relevant in our time as it was 12 centuries ago when the House of Wisdom stood at the center of the intellectual world. The mysterious collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. Imagine a world of gleaming palaces and sprawling trade networks, where merchants carry precious metals and exotic goods between bustling ports, where scribes record transactions on clay tablets in complex writing systems, and mighty kings exchange diplomatic letters addressing each other as brother. This was the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, a sophisticated international system connecting the great civilizations of Egypt, Hittite Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, Assyria, Babylonia, and Canaan in a golden age of commerce and culture. Then, with startling speed, it all collapsed. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, nearly every major city in the eastern Mediterranean world was destroyed, abandoned, or drastically reduced. Mighty empires that had stood for centuries vanished, writing systems disappeared, trade routes closed, technologies were lost, the world's first complex international system shattered into isolated villages struggling for survival. This catastrophic collapse, perhaps the most dramatic in human history before the fall of Rome, remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. How could such advanced civilizations, which had weathered countless challenges over centuries, suddenly disintegrate within a single generation? What force or combination of forces could bring down not just one empire, but an entire interconnected world system? The Bronze Age collapse stands as both cautionary tale and enduring puzzle, a reminder that even the most sophisticated civilizations can prove fragile in the face of rapid change. The search for answers has led archaeologists, historians, climatologists, and economists to develop competing theories, each offering partial explanations for this extraordinary event that redrew the map of the ancient world and sent humanity into a dark age that would last for centuries. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, we must first understand what was lost. The Late Bronze Age, spanning roughly from 1550 to 1200 BCE, represented one of history's first periods of genuine internationalism. These weren't primitive societies. They were complex states with bureaucracies, standing armies, international diplomacy, and economic interdependence. Egypt under the New Kingdom had reached the height of its imperial power, extending influence from Nubia to the Euphrates. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, modern Turkey, and northern Syria. The Mycenaeans dominated the Greek mainland, having absorbed the influence of Minoan Crete. In Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylonia maintained sophisticated urban civilizations. The coastal cities of the Levant, like Ugarit, served as crucial trading hubs connecting maritime and overland routes. These powers maintained diplomatic relations documented in cuneiform tablets discovered at sites like Amarna in Egypt and Hattusa, the Hittite capital. Royal correspondence, preserved in archives, reveals rulers exchanging elaborate gifts, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and addressing each other as equals in a club of great powers. One Babylonian king complained to Pharaoh about sending insufficient gold for a building project, writing with remarkable directness. gold in your country is like dust. One simply gathers it up. Trade flowed freely across political boundaries. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Egypt, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and precious crafts from across the Mediterranean moved through maritime and overland trade networks. Archaeologists have discovered the remnants of this international commerce in shipwrecks like Uluburun off the Turkish coast, which carried a cargo so diverse: Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jewelry, African ebony, Baltic amber. It reads like an inventory of the known world. This wasn't just an age of commerce, but of cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts moved alongside goods. Writing systems spread, with linear B in Greece, hieroglyphics in Egypt, and cuneiform used as a diplomatic lingua franca. Palatial elites from different regions adopted similar architectural styles and artistic motifs. This was globalization before the modern era, a complex system of interdependent states linked by trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Then suddenly, within the span of a few decades around 1200 BCE, this world collapsed. For much of the 20th century, the leading explanation centered on a mysterious group known as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, describe attacks by coalition of maritime raiders with names like Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, and Denayan. Reliefs at Medinet Habu show the Egyptians battling these invaders in a great sea and land battle, ultimately defeating them. For decades, archaeologists attributed the Bronze Age collapse primarily to these sea peoples, imagining waves of warriors destroying city after city across the Mediterranean. More recent scholarship has significantly complicated this picture. Rather than a single invading force, the Sea Peoples appear to have been diverse groups displaced by the very collapse they're accused of causing, both victims and agents of a broader catastrophe. The identity of these groups remains controversial. The Peliset may have been early Philistines who eventually settled in Canaan. Others might represent displaced Mycenaeans, Anatolians, or Western Mediterranean peoples. Rather than a coordinated invasion, their movements more likely represent mass migration and desperate raiding by populations already uprooted by crises in their homelands. Climate change now appears to have played a crucial role in triggering the collapse. Paleoclimatic data from lake beds, seabed cores, and cave speleothems reveals evidence of a major drought across the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BCE. Tree ring studies show this drought persisted for decades, creating what climatologists call a mega-drought. In agricultural societies dependent on annual grain harvests, such extended drought meant widespread famine. The Hittite Empire, particularly vulnerable with its capital in the rain-dependent Anatolian plateau, records desperate grain shipments from Egypt in its final decades. A letter from the last Hittite king speaks with alarming directness. It is a matter of life or death. Famine leads to population movement, social unrest, and political instability. As agricultural systems failed, rural populations would have abandoned farms for cities, fled to other regions, or turned to raiding and piracy. This creates a plausible scenario: climate change triggering food shortages, which created refugees and raiders. The Sea Peoples, whose movements further disrupted already stressed systems. But climate alone doesn't explain the totality of collapse. After all, these civilizations had weathered previous droughts. Some archaeologists argue that the Bronze Age world had become too complex, specialized, and interconnected for its own good, vulnerable to cascading system failure when multiple crises hit simultaneously. The Bronze Age economy relied on long-distance trade and remarkable specialization. Cyprus produced copper, Afghanistan supplied tin, the two metals needed to make bronze. Egypt contributed grain, and various regions provided specialized crafts. This interdependence created efficiency, but also vulnerability. If key nodes in the network failed, the entire system could unravel. Archaeologist Eric Klein compares this to modern supply chains. When one crucial component is unavailable, production can halt entirely. When the Bronze Age trade networks began to fail, whether from climate stress, population movements, or political instability, the specialized production systems collapsed. Without tin from distant sources, bronze couldn't be produced. Without bronze, tools and weapons couldn't be made. Without tools, other production failed, a cascade of breakdown. Recent archaeological evidence suggests another factor may have contributed to the collapse: earthquake storms. Geologists have identified evidence of major seismic activity across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Key sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, Troy, and Ugarit show characteristic earthquake damage. The eastern Mediterranean sits at the junction of major tectonic plates, making it prone to earthquakes. Geological studies suggest the region sometimes experiences earthquake storms, periods of increased seismic activity lasting decades. Such a storm, striking civilizations already weakened by drought and social stress, could have delivered a devastating blow to urban infrastructure. Weakened by these natural disasters, Bronze Age kingdoms may also have faced internal political crises. The period's palace-centered economies concentrated wealth and power in administrative centers. When these centralized systems failed, whether from natural disaster, invasion, or economic disruption, entire kingdoms became ungovernable. Evidence suggests social unrest accompanied the collapse. In Greece, some Mycenaean citadels show signs of being strengthened shortly before their destruction, suggesting fear of attack, possibly from their own populations. The concentration of wealth in palaces would have created tension during times of scarcity, potentially leading to internal rebellion when systems began to fail. Ironically, technological change may have contributed to the fall of these Bronze Age powers. The period around 1200 BCE saw the transition from bronze to iron weapons. While bronze is actually superior to early iron, it required those scarce, traded materials, copper and tin. Iron, while initially inferior, had a crucial advantage. It was locally available in many regions. As trade networks became unstable, iron technology, initially practiced by smaller peripheral groups, gained advantage. Traditional powers, invested in bronze production and dependent on long-distance trade, couldn't adapt quickly enough when those networks collapsed. This technological transition didn't cause the collapse, but may have accelerated it and prevented recovery. The interactions between these factors, climate change, population movements, systemic economic vulnerability, natural disasters, political instability, and technological disruption, created a perfect storm that overwhelmed even these sophisticated civilizations. No single cause adequately explains the collapse. Together, they created a cascade of failures from which recovery became impossible. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant today is how it illuminates the vulnerability of complex, interconnected systems, a lesson with obvious parallels to our globalized world. When multiple crises converge, even advanced societies can reach breaking points with stunning speed. The aftermath of the collapse transformed the Mediterranean world. The power vacuum created by the fall of these empires eventually allowed new peoples to emerge: Phoenicians, Aramaeans, early Greeks, and Israelites among them. These groups would develop the alphabetic writing systems, maritime trade networks, and cultural innovations that shaped the classical world. Iron became the dominant metal, giving its name to the New Age. Political systems became more diverse, with city-states, tribal confederations, and smaller kingdoms replacing the great territorial empires of the Bronze Age. Some scholars argue this more decentralized world ultimately proved more innovative and resilient than the top-heavy palace systems it replaced. Over 3,000 years later, archaeologists continue discovering new evidence about this pivotal moment in human history. In the layers of ash and abandoned storerooms, in shipwrecks and palace archives, they piece together the story of civilization's first great collapse. Clay tablets baked hard in the fires that destroyed the cities preserve desperate messages from the final days, like the letter from Ugarit's last king that breaks off mid-sentence: "The city destroyed before it could be completed." The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that progress is not linear. Civilizations can advance for centuries, creating art, architecture, literature, and complex economies, only to regress dramatically when their foundations erode. Technologies and knowledge painfully accumulated over generations, from writing systems to architectural techniques, can be lost with startling speed, yet it also demonstrates human resilience. Though the collapse created centuries of darkness, new civilizations eventually emerged, building on surviving knowledge while developing innovations the Bronze Age world never imagined. The Phoenician alphabet, Greek philosophy, and Israelite monotheism, cultural achievements that would shape world history, all developed in the aftermath of this catastrophic collapse. As we face our own convergence of challenges, climate change, resource constraints, technological disruption, and political instability, the Bronze Age collapse offers both warning and reassurance. Warning that even advanced civilizations can fail when multiple crises overwhelm their adaptive capacity. Reassurance that humanity has faced system collapse before and eventually forged new paths forward. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Bronze Age collapse is how it appeared in later cultural memory. The Greeks remembered it as a lost golden age, when heroes of godlike strength and skill built massive structures ordinary men could no longer replicate. Biblical narratives of exodus and conquest took shape against this backdrop of collapsing empires. For generations after, people lived amid ruined palaces and cities they could not rebuild, monuments to forgotten knowledge and lost glory. In our own time of rapid change and growing uncertainty, this ancient collapse speaks to us across the millennia, a complex cautionary tale about the fragility of human achievements and the eternal challenge of maintaining what we've built against the forces of disruption, both natural and human-made. The lost colony of Roanoke, America's oldest mystery. Imagine sailing across the vast Atlantic in a wooden ship, leaving behind everything familiar to establish a foothold in a new world. In 1587, 117 English men, women, and children did exactly that, landing on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They came with dreams of a prosperous New English settlement in America, bringing tools, supplies, and hope for the future. Their governor, John White, set sail back to England for additional supplies, expecting to return within months. Instead, he was delayed for 3 long years by England's war with Spain. When he finally returned in August 1590, he found an abandoned settlement, The colonists, including his daughter and granddaughter, the first English child born in America, had vanished without a trace. All that remained were two cryptic clues, the word Croatoan carved into a post, and the letters C-R-O etched into a tree. More than 4 centuries later, the fate of these 117 souls remains America's oldest unsolved mystery. Their disappearance stands at the shadowy intersection of colonial ambition, indigenous relations, and survival on the edge of the known world. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Were they massacred by hostile Native Americans? Did they attempt to sail back to England and perish at sea? Did they integrate with friendly indigenous tribes? Or is the truth something no one has yet imagined? This enduring historical enigma has generated theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastical, inspired archaeological investigations that continue to this day and embedded itself in American folklore as our first and perhaps greatest historical mystery. A story of disappearance without resolution at the very dawn of European settlement in North America. To understand what might have happened to the colonists, we need to understand why they came to Roanoke in the first place and the complex web of motivations, personalities, and geopolitical forces that placed them in such a precarious position. The Roanoke voyages emerged from Elizabethan England's growing imperial ambitions in the late 16th century. Spain dominated the New World, extracting immense wealth from Mexico and Peru, while establishing colonies throughout the Caribbean and Florida. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, sought to challenge Spanish dominance, disrupt Spanish shipping through privateering, state-sanctioned piracy, and establish its own colonial foothold in North America. The driving force behind the Roanoke expeditions was Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth's court. Charismatic, ambitious, and well-connected, Raleigh obtained a royal patent in 1584 to colonize North America. He named the territory Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and dispatched an exploratory expedition that same year. The explorers returned with glowing reports of Roanoke Island, a protected location with friendly Native Americans and abundant resources. Based on these promising accounts, Raleigh organized a larger expedition in 1585, led by Sir Richard Grenville and including approximately 100 men, who would remain to establish England's first New World colony. This first colony, essentially a military outpost, quickly ran into problems. Relations with the local Socotan people deteriorated after the English burned a village in retaliation for a stolen silver cup. Food supplies dwindled. When Sir Francis Drake visited in 1586 after raiding Spanish Caribbean settlements, the discouraged colonists abandoned their posts and returned to England with him. Undeterred, Raleigh organized a more ambitious effort in 1587, a true settlement rather than a military outpost. This time he recruited families rather than just soldiers, and appointed John White, an artist who had participated in the previous expedition, as governor. White's detailed watercolors of the region's plants, animals, and indigenous people from the 1585 expedition remain invaluable historical documents today. The 1587 expedition included 117 colonists, men, women, and children, intent on establishing a permanent settlement called the City of Raleigh. Among them were White's daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. Shortly after arriving, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, whose fate would become inextricably linked with the colony's mysterious end. Almost immediately, the colonists faced significant challenges. They arrived too late in the growing season to establish adequate crops. The previous colonists' conflicts with indigenous peoples created tensions, and rather than their intended destination at Chesapeake Bay, their pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to take them further than Roanoke Island, where prospects for a successful settlement were significantly poorer. Facing these difficulties, the colonists persuaded Governor White to return to England for supplies and reinforcements. White was reluctant to leave his family, but agreed, expecting to return the following year. He could not have imagined it would be 3 years before he would make it back to Roanoke. As White sailed for England in late 1587, the international situation dramatically complicated his mission. Relations between England and Spain had deteriorated, culminating in the launch of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Queen Elizabeth ordered all English ships to remain in port to defend against possible invasion. Despite receiving some supplies and 2 small vessels in 1588, White's relief expedition was attacked by French pirates, losing their supplies and forcing a return to England. Finally, in August 1590, White secured passage on a privateering expedition willing to stop at Roanoke. When he arrived on August 18th, his granddaughter Virginia's 3rd birthday, he found the settlement deserted. The houses had been dismantled, suggesting an orderly departure rather than a hasty evacuation. There were no signs of a struggle or violence, no graves, and crucially, no bodies. The only clues were the word Croatoan carved into a post of the fort and CRO carved into a nearby tree. Before his departure, White had arranged that if the colonists needed to relocate, they would carve their destination on a tree or post. A cross would indicate the move was made under distress, but no cross was found with the carvings. Croatoan was the name of both a nearby island, now called Hatteras Island, and the Native American tribe that inhabited it. The Croatoan had been friendly to the English in previous encounters. White believed the carving indicated the colonists had relocated there, but before he could investigate, a massive storm arose. With damaged ships and dwindling supplies, the expedition's captain insisted on sailing for the Caribbean. Despite White's desperate pleas to search for his family, he was forced to return to England without answers. White never returned to America. He died around 1593, never learning what happened to his daughter, son-in-law, granddaughter, or the other 114 colonists. Raleigh, distracted by other ventures and eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London after Elizabeth's death, sent no further expeditions specifically to find the colonists. When the English established Jamestown in 1607, they did make inquiries about the fate of the Roanoke colonists. Captain John Smith heard reports that there were people living in the region with white children who could talk in a book, possibly meaning they could read. The Jamestown leader, John Smith, sent 2 search parties, but they were unsuccessful in finding definitive evidence. The most tantalizing account came from William Strachey, Jamestown's secretary, who in 1612 wrote that the Powhatan tribe had massacred the colonists because they were living with another tribe, the Chesapeans. According to this account, only 4 men, 2 boys, and a young maid escaped. However, this report came decades after the disappearance and has not been independently confirmed. With such limited contemporary evidence, the fate of the colonists has spawned numerous theories over the centuries, some more plausible than others. The most widely accepted theory today is that the colonists relocated to Croatoan Island, Hatteras, or mainland areas associated with friendly indigenous groups. Facing starvation on Roanoke, they likely accepted invitation from allies, like Monteo, a Croatoan who had traveled to England and served as the colonists' interpreter. Over time, with no contact with England, they may have gradually integrated into indigenous communities through cooperation, intermarriage, and cultural assimilation. Evidence supporting this theory includes accounts from later European explorers who reported seeing Native Americans with European physical characteristics, using European farming techniques, or possessing heirlooms like books and brass items. A 1709 survey mentioned Indians who formerly lived on Roanoke Island, who had white skin and gray eyes, that show themselves to be descended from Christians. Archaeological findings have lent some support to this integration theory. Excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered numerous European artifacts from the appropriate time period, including a signet ring with a lion design similar to those used by English gentry. Recent excavations at a site called Site X on the mainland near Roanoke have uncovered European artifacts potentially linked to the colonists. Genetics might eventually provide answers. The Lost Colony DNA Project seeks to identify descendants of the colonists by comparing DNA from current populations with genealogical records of the original colonists' families. Some families in North Carolina, particularly among the Lumbee tribe, have oral traditions claiming descent from the Roanoke colonists. A darker possibility is that the colonists met a violent end. They might have been attacked by hostile indigenous groups like the Secretans, with whom earlier colonists had conflicts. Alternatively, they could have been targeted by Spanish forces moving north from Florida, as Spain claimed all of North America and viewed English settlements as illegal encroachments. Spain did send expeditions to find and destroy the English colony, though no Spanish records indicate they ever located Roanoke. Other theories suggest the colonists attempted to return to England on their own. Without proper ships, they might have built small vessels or attempted to modify their boats, only to perish at sea. Alternatively, they could have moved inland, perhaps trying to reach the Chesapeake Bay, their original destination, or searching for rumored gold mines, only to succumb to starvation, disease, or conflicts with inland tribes. More outlandish theories have included alien abduction, a prehistoric civilization adopting them, or secret relocation to Bermuda. These lack any historical or archaeological support and represent the way the mystery has captured imaginations over the centuries. The true significance of the lost colony extends beyond the mystery itself. Roanoke represents the first serious English attempt at permanent settlement in North America, laying groundwork for the successful Jamestown colony 2 decades later. The challenges faced by the Roanoke colonists, adaptation to unfamiliar environments, complex relations with indigenous peoples, maintaining supply lines across the Atlantic, would define early colonial experiences throughout North America. The story also illuminates the broader context of European imperial competition. England, Spain, France, and later the Netherlands all sought footholds in the Americas. With indigenous peoples caught between these competing powers, the colonists landed in a complex indigenous political landscape they poorly understood, while simultaneously serving as pawns in European power struggles they couldn't control from their isolated position. In American cultural memory, the lost colony has taken on mythic dimensions. Virginia Dare, the innocent child born at the dawn of English America, only to vanish without trace, became a powerful symbol in American identity formation. Her image has been appropriated for everything from white supremacist narratives of pure Anglo-Saxon heritage to feminist retellings emphasizing female resilience in colonial ventures. The continuing fascination with Roanoke also reflects something deeper about American identity. As a nation founded by immigrants, America's origin stories often emphasize brave pioneers facing wilderness challenges. Yet the Roanoke mystery suggests a more complex beginning, one of failure, abandonment, and possibly integration with indigenous peoples, complicating tidy narratives of successful settlement and conquest. Modern archaeological efforts continue to search for definitive answers. Advances in technology have enabled archaeologists to investigate sites using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other non-invasive techniques. Rising sea levels have complicated these efforts, as coastal erosion has claimed portions of Roanoke Island since the 16th century, potentially washing away evidence. Perhaps the most promising recent development comes from the use of advanced imaging techniques on John White's map of the region. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum discovered that White had placed a patch over part of his map. Underneath was a four-pointed star, marking a site on the mainland where the colonists may have planned a more permanent settlement. This Site X has yielded promising archaeological findings, though not yet definitive proof of the colonists' presence. Meanwhile, the mystery continues to inspire novels, films, television shows, and even a centuries-old outdoor drama performed annually in Manteo, North Carolina. The word Croatoan has entered popular culture as a shorthand for mysterious disappearances, appearing in contexts from horror stories to science fiction. What makes The Lost Colony so enduringly fascinating is how it combines both historical significance and compelling human drama. Behind the archaeological puzzle are 117 individual stories, parents and children, craftsmen and farmers, all seeking better lives in an unfamiliar land. Their disappearance reminds us how tenuous early European settlement in North America truly was, how dependent colonists were on both indigenous knowledge and continued support from across the Atlantic. 4 centuries later, the fate of the Roanoke colonists remains tantalizingly out of reach, close enough that new archaeological discoveries might finally solve the mystery, yet obscured enough by time that we may never know with certainty what happened after Governor White sailed away. In that ambiguous space, America's oldest mystery continues to capture imaginations, reminding us of the fragility of human endeavors and the countless untold stories at the margins of history's grand narratives. Whether the colonists found new lives among indigenous communities, met violent ends, or attempted a desperate journey elsewhere, their story marks the uncertain beginning of English America, not a triumphant foundation myth, but a more human tale of risk, adaptation, and ultimately disappearance, with only a single word carved in wood to mark their passing: Croatoan. Hannibal's impossible journey. Elephants across the Alps. The air thins as you climb higher, each breath burning in your lungs. Below, stretching back for miles, winds a column of men, horses, and impossible beasts, massive gray creatures with curving tusks and trunks that sway with each labored step. This is no ordinary army. This is the force that will bring Rome to its knees, or so believes the man riding at its head, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian commander who has chosen the unthinkable to invade Italy by crossing the seemingly impassable barrier of the Alps. The year is 218 BCE. Rome and Carthage, Mediterranean superpowers, are locked in a death struggle that will determine the fate of the Western world. And one man has decided to do what no military leader before him dared attempt: bring war directly to Roman soil through one of history's most audacious gambles. This is not just a tale of military strategy. This is a story of human endurance, tactical genius, cultural clash, and nature's merciless power. It's a journey that would become legend, studied by military commanders from Napoleon to Patton, and debated by historians for over 2,000 years. To understand why Hannibal chose this seemingly suicidal path, we must first understand the man himself and the blood oath that drove him. Born in 247 BCE to Carthage's leading military family, Hannibal was raised in the shadow of defeat. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had been Carthage's greatest general in the First Punic War, a 23-year conflict that ended with Rome stripping Carthage of Sicily and imposing crushing war reparations. Carthage, once the undisputed commercial power of the Mediterranean, with colonies stretching from North Africa to Spain, found itself humiliated and financially crippled. For the proud trading empire founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier, this was intolerable. Hamilcar refused to accept this new order. Unable to challenge Rome directly, he turned to Spain, a land rich in silver mines and fighting men, to rebuild Carthaginian power. Before departing for this new frontier, he performed a ceremony that would shape world history, taking his 9-year-old son Hannibal before a statue of the god Baal. He made the boy place his hand on a sacrificial victim and swear eternal hatred for Rome. "I swear," the child said, words that would echo across his lifetime and beyond. For 16 years, first under his father and then his brother-in-law, after Hamilcar's death, Hannibal learned the arts of war and leadership in Spain. He studied Greek military texts, mastered multiple languages to communicate with his diverse troops, and absorbed every tactical lesson his father could impart. When he took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain, at just 26 years old, he was already a seasoned commander. The spark that ignited the Second Punic War came in 219 BCE, when Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. The Romans, outraged, demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. War was declared. Roman strategy seemed obvious. One consular army would engage Hannibal in Spain, while another would strike at Carthage itself in North Africa. It was logical, methodical, and exactly what Hannibal anticipated. His response was anything but expected. Instead of waiting to be attacked, Hannibal would bring the war to Italy itself, striking at the heart of Roman power, while their forces were divided. But how to reach Italy? The Romans controlled the sea with their superior navy. The coastal route was blocked by hostile Gallic tribes allied with Rome. This left only one path, through the towering Alpine mountains that protected Italy's northern frontier. No army had ever attempted such a crossing. The Romans considered it impossible, which is precisely why Hannibal chose it. In May 218 BCE, Hannibal departed New Carthage, modern Cartagena, Spain, with a force that defies easy categorization. This wasn't merely a Carthaginian army, it was a multicultural military enterprise. At its core were 20,000 African infantry, Libyans, Numidians, and Carthaginians, hardened veterans loyal to the Barca family. Supporting them were 12,000 Spanish infantry and 6,000 cavalry, fierce tribal warriors whose hit-and-run tactics would prove devastating against Rome's rigid formations. And then there were the elephants, 37 North African forest elephants, smaller than their Indian or African savanna cousins, but still formidable war machines trained to charge enemy lines and create panic. For many of Hannibal's men, who had never seen such creatures. The elephants must have seemed as exotic and terrifying as they would later appear to the Romans. The logistics of moving such a force over 1,500 miles of hostile territory staggers the mind. Each day, this army required approximately 30 tons of grain and 150,000 liters of water, just for the humans. The animals needed even more. Without modern supply chains, every step took Hannibal further from his bases and deeper into enemy territory. The initial march through southern Gaul, modern France, proved challenging but manageable. Celtic tribes, many with grievances against Roman expansion, provided supplies and guides. Others, loyal to Rome, offered resistance that Hannibal efficiently crushed. By August, his army reached the Rhone River, a formidable barrier nearly a half-mile wide in places. Meanwhile, the Romans had realized Hannibal's intentions. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio sailed for southern Gaul, hoping to intercept the Carthaginian army before it could reach the Alps. It became a race, Hannibal needing to cross the river before Roman forces arrived. The river crossing showcased Hannibal's meticulous planning. He gathered boats and built rafts while sending a detachment upstream to cross and outflank hostile Gauls on the opposite bank. The elephants posed a unique challenge. They refused to board rafts. Hannibal's engineers constructed floating platforms covered with earth to fool the animals into thinking they remained on solid ground. Just 3 days after completing the crossing, Roman cavalry scouts appeared. Had Scipio arrived with his main force, Hannibal might have been caught in the open. Instead, believing the Alps crossing impossible so late in the season, Scipio returned to his ships, planning to intercept Hannibal when he emerged in northern Italy, if he emerged at all. As September arrived, Hannibal faced his greatest challenge. His army turned eastward, leaving the relative safety of the Rhone Valley and moving into the foothills of the Alps. The air grew colder. The trails narrowed. Local guides became increasingly unreliable, and the mountain tribes watched the strange procession with predatory interest. We still debate which alpine pass Hannibal used. The Col du Clapier, Col de la Traversette, and Col du Mont Genèvre all have scholarly supporters. Recent environmental evidence, including discoveries of horse manure preserved in ancient soil layers, suggests the Traversette, one of the highest and most difficult passes, but offering the shortest route. The ascent began relatively smoothly, but on the third day Hannibal's army encountered its first major crisis. Local Allobroge tribesmen, initially appearing friendly, launched a devastating ambush from the high ground as the Carthaginian column stretched thin along a narrow mountain path. Boulders and javelins rained down. Pack animals panicked, slipping off the path to their deaths hundreds of feet below, taking valuable supplies with them. Only Hannibal's foresight saved his army from annihilation. He had placed his best troops at the rear, anticipating treachery. These elite soldiers cleared the heights, driving off the attackers and allowing the column to continue, though with significant losses. The higher they climbed, the more hostile the environment became. By October, snow already covered the higher elevations. For Hannibal's North African troops, who had never experienced snow, this alien white substance must have seemed like another enemy. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Avalanches took entire units in seconds. Food supplies dwindled as pack animals died from cold or starvation. Then came the infamous blocked path, a section of trail destroyed by a landslide, creating a gap impossible to bypass. Ancient sources describe how Hannibal's engineers, showing remarkable ingenuity, used vinegar to dissolve the limestone rocks blocking their way. then applied fire to crack them, clearing a route wide enough for the elephants to pass single file. Modern scientists debate whether this technique would actually work, but something allowed Hannibal to overcome this obstacle when retreat seemed the only option. Perhaps it was a combination of methods: cutting back the cliff face with tools, building scaffolding with local timber, and the sheer determination that characterized the entire expedition. After 15 grueling days in the mountains, Hannibal's army reached the summit. Polybius, the Greek historian who retraced the route a generation later, describes how Hannibal assembled his exhausted men to show them the view, the fertile plains of northern Italy spread out below, their reward for unimaginable hardship. "You are now crossing not only the walls of Italy," he told them, "but of Rome itself." The descent proved almost as deadly as the ascent. On the steeper Italian side, men and animals slipped on icy slopes. The path, barely wide enough for infantry, required more engineering to accommodate the elephants. When they finally reached lower elevations with vegetation, many animals died from overconsumption after near starvation. When Hannibal finally reached the Po Valley in northern Italy, his losses were staggering. Of the 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry that left Spain, only 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry remained. Most of the elephants had perished, with perhaps fewer than 10 surviving. Any other commander might have considered this a catastrophic failure. Hannibal saw it differently. He had achieved what everyone, especially the Romans, considered impossible. He had invaded Italy from its blind side, where no defenses waited. He had reached lands populated by Gallic tribes who hated Roman expansion and would provide recruits to replace his losses. And most importantly, he had completed the first step in his grand strategy to defeat Rome on its home ground. The Romans, characteristically, refused to panic. Consul Publius Scipio, having raced back from France, engaged Hannibal at the Ticinus River in November. It was a minor cavalry skirmish, but it established a pattern. Roman infantry might be superior, but Hannibal's Numidian cavalry commanded the open field. Scipio himself was wounded and nearly captured, saved only by the bravery of his 17-year-old son, the future Scipio Africanus, who would eventually defeat Hannibal. A month later came Hannibal's first major victory on Italian soil. At the Trebia River, he lured the Roman army under Tiberius Sempronius Longus into crossing the frigid December waters by using a small detachment as bait. Cold, wet, and hungry, Hannibal had deliberately scheduled the battle before breakfast. The Romans marched straight into a classic double envelopment. Carthaginian forces hidden in nearby ravines struck their flanks while the main force engaged them frontally. Of 40,000 Romans, only 10,000 cut their way out. Hannibal's tactical genius had transformed his weakened army into a devastating fighting force that would dominate Italy for the next 15 years, winning spectacular victories at Lake Trasimene and most famously at Cannae, where he executed history's most perfect double envelopment, destroying an 80,000-strong Roman army. Yet despite these victories, Hannibal never achieved his strategic objective, breaking Rome's network of alliances that provided seemingly endless manpower. Most Italian cities remained loyal to Rome, and Carthage never sent significant reinforcements. After Cannae, Rome adopted Quintus Fabius Maximus's strategy of avoiding direct confrontation while attacking Hannibal's supply lines, the Fabian strategy still studied in military academies today. The tide turned when Rome sent young Scipio to attack Carthaginian Spain, cutting off Hannibal from reinforcement and forcing Carthage to recall him to defend North Africa. At Zama in 202 BCE, student defeated teacher. Hannibal lost his only battle, and with it, the war. Carthage accepted punishing peace terms, ending its status as a major power forever. Hannibal survived as a statesman and later as an advisor to Eastern kingdoms, hostile to Rome, but never ceased being hunted by his eternal enemy. When Roman agents finally closed in on him in Bithynia in 183 BCE, he took poison, declaring, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." The Alpine crossing, that seemingly impossible feat that opened the war, remains Hannibal's most enduring legacy. It represents the triumph of human determination over nature's most formidable barriers. Engineers marvel at the logistics. Military strategists study the operational audacity. Historians debate the exact route, with new archaeological evidence still emerging 2 millennia later. But perhaps Hannibal's greatest achievement was psychological. By doing what everyone, especially the Romans, considered impossible, he shattered Rome's sense of invulnerability. He forced the rising Mediterranean power to recognize that no mountain range, no natural barrier, could protect them from a determined enemy led by genius. Rome would eventually recover and destroy Carthage completely in the Third Punic War, but the Republic never forgot the lesson of those elephants crossing the Alps. Roman roads, colonies, and military installations would spread across Europe in the following centuries, creating the infrastructure of an empire determined never again to be caught by surprise. Hannibal never captured Rome. By conventional metrics, his campaign ultimately failed, yet his journey across the Alps stands as one of history's most audacious military achievements, a reminder that the greatest limits we face are often not physical barriers, but the boundaries of imagination. In crossing the Alps, Hannibal crossed the threshold between the possible and impossible, and in doing so, earned immortality. The women of Bletchley Park, Codebreakers who changed World War II. The year is 1941. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. The Atlantic Ocean has become a killing field as German U-boats sink Allied supply ships with devastating efficiency. In London, children sleep in underground stations during nightly bombing raids. The war effort teeters on the brink of collapse. Yet in a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, surrounded by hastily constructed wooden huts, a secret army is fighting back, not with guns or bombs, but with pencils, paper, and pioneering computing machines. Most remarkably, the majority of these silent warriors are young women, college graduates, debutantes, teachers, and shop assistants, turned codebreakers. This is Bletchley Park, Britain's ultra-secret code-breaking center, where approximately 75% of the 10,000 staff were women. Their work remained classified for decades after the war, their contributions unacknowledged, their stories untold. Yet by breaking Germany's military codes, particularly the seemingly unbreakable Enigma cipher, these women shortened World War II by an estimated 2 to 4 years, saving millions of lives. This is the story of how women from all walks of British society, bound by secrecy so absolute that many kept their wartime work hidden, even from spouses for half a century, helped win the war with their intellects, persistence, and remarkable ability to recognize patterns in a sea of seeming randomness. To understand the significance of their achievement, we must first understand the challenge they faced. The German military communicated using the Enigma machine, an electromechanical encryption device resembling a typewriter, but with extraordinary security features. Each keystroke passed through a series of rotating wheels, electrical pathways, and plugboard connections to produce a ciphertext that seemed like completely random gibberish. What made Enigma so formidable was its astronomical number of possible settings. With 3 rotating wheels and a plugboard, the military version had approximately 159 quintillion possible configurations. Even if you knew you had an Enigma machine, without knowing the exact daily settings, breaking the code through brute force seemed mathematically impossible. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. This confidence led them to use it for virtually all military communications, army movements, U-boat locations, supply convoys, bombing targets. If these messages could somehow be deciphered, the Allies would essentially be reading Hitler's mail. Prior to the war, Polish mathematicians had made crucial early breakthroughs in attacking Enigma. But when Poland fell in 1939, this work transferred to Britain, where Bletchley Park, known as BP to insiders or by its official designation, Station X, became the headquarters for Allied code-breaking operations. The recruitment process for Bletchley was as unconventional as the work itself. Some women were approached after winning crossword competitions in national newspapers. Oxford and Cambridge Dons quietly recommended their brightest female students. The Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENS, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAFs, and Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, assigned promising recruits. Many arrived having no idea what they would be doing, only that it was described as special duties of vital importance. Upon arrival, each woman signed the Official Secrets Act, binding them to absolute secrecy under threat of imprisonment. Many weren't told the full significance of their work even once inside. The facility operated on a strict need-to-know basis. Workers in one hut often had no idea what happened in adjacent buildings. The secrecy was so complete that some women only discovered decades later that friends they'd made during the war had also been at Bletchley, working in different sections. The women at Bletchley Park fell broadly into several categories, though with significant overlap in their work. The largest group performed clerical and support functions, intercepting encrypted messages from listening stations across Britain, cataloging information, and managing the vast flow of intelligence. Though sometimes characterized as mere clerical staff, these roles required meticulous attention to detail, identifying subtle patterns that might provide breakthroughs. A second group operated the bomb machines, electromechanical devices designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman to automate the process of testing possible Enigma settings. While popular culture has focused on the male mathematicians who designed these machines, it was predominantly WRENS who operated them around the clock, maintaining the devices, setting them up with different configurations, and interpreting the results. Dorothy Dubuisson and Elsie Booker, both WRENS, supervised bomb operations and trained hundreds of other women. The work was physically demanding and mentally exhausting. Each bomb weighed a ton, generated tremendous heat, and made a constant racket that one wren compared to 1,000 knitting needles. The women worked 8-hour shifts in hot, noisy conditions, constantly monitoring the machines for the telltale signs that they had found a match. A third, smaller group of women were directly involved in cryptanalysis, the actual breaking of codes. These included some of Britain's most brilliant female mathematicians and linguists, many recruited from prestigious universities, while male cryptanalysts like Alan Turing and Dilly Knox have received most historical attention. Women like Joan Clark, Margaret Rock, and Mavis Beatty made crucial contributions to breaking different Enigma variants. Joan Clark, recruited straight from Cambridge, where she had earned a double first in mathematics, became deputy head of Hut 8, the section responsible for breaking German naval codes, arguably the most critical operation at Bletchley given the U-boat threat to supply convoys. Though briefly engaged to Alan Turing, Clark's mathematical brilliance stood on its own. She devised techniques for breaking naval enigma that proved crucial to Allied survival. Mavis Beatty, née Lever, just 19 when recruited, helped break the Italian naval enigma, providing intelligence that contributed to the British victory at the Battle of Matapan in 1941. In December 1941, she broke a crucial message that revealed the operating procedures of the Abwehr Enigma, the German military intelligence service's even more secure version of the standard Enigma machine. The work at Bletchley extended beyond Enigma. In Hut 6 and later Block F, a unique workforce largely composed of women tackled other German ciphers. The Lorenz cipher, used for Hitler's highest-level communications with his generals, was even more complex than Enigma. Attacking this system required the development of Colossus, the world's first programmable electronic computer. While designed by Tommy Flowers, this revolutionary machine was primarily operated by Wrens, who became the world's first computer programmers without even knowing it. Dorothy Carey, a vicar's daughter from London serving as a Wren, recalled learning to operate Colossus. We were told exactly what buttons to push, what plugs to plug in. It was exciting to use because you knew it was doing something terribly important, but you didn't know what it was doing. A surprising number of women at Bletchley came from backgrounds in linguistics rather than mathematics. Germany, like most nations, encoded messages after writing them in the clear. Once the ciphertext was broken back into German, understanding and analyzing the content required fluent German speakers. Ruth Briggs, recruited because of her first-class degree in German from the University of London, worked in Hut 4, translating decrypted naval messages. Her knowledge of German naval terminology proved invaluable for interpreting technical communications about U-boat operations. Similar skills were needed for Japanese, Italian, and other Axis communications targeted by Bletchley Codebreakers. The conditions at Bletchley were far from glamorous. The mansion and surrounding huts were overcrowded, often freezing in winter and stifling in summer. Many women lived in requisitioned houses in nearby villages, cycling miles to work regardless of weather. Security measures meant blacked-out windows and minimal heating. One veteran recalled wearing gloves, with the fingertips cut off to keep warm while working. The pressure was relentless. German codes changed daily at midnight, meaning each morning began with a desperate race to break the new day's settings. Until these were found, all intercepted messages remained unreadable, potentially containing vital information about imminent attacks or troop movements. Lives literally hung in the balance while the codebreakers worked. Charlotte Webb, who operated the bombs as a teenager, later recalled, "You were never allowed to make a mistake because it could cost thousands of lives, so we were always aware that we couldn't make a single error." Despite these pressures, a unique culture emerged at Bletchley. Class barriers, still rigid in 1940s Britain, broke down amid the shared mission. Debutantes worked alongside factory girls. Academic women found themselves valued for their intellects rather than facing the discrimination common in civilian universities. Shift work and the intensity of the mission created deep bonds among the women who, unable to discuss their work with outsiders, relied on each other for support. The success of the Bletchley Park operation cannot be overstated. By 1943, Allied commanders could read many German communications almost as quickly as the intended recipients. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, provided unprecedented insight into enemy plans, troop movements, and weaknesses. During the Battle of the Atlantic, breaking naval enigma allowed Allied convoys to be routed around U-boat wolf packs. Before Enigma was broken, U-boats were sinking over 300,000 tons of shipping monthly. Afterward, losses fell dramatically, securing the vital supply line between North America and Britain. For the D-Day landings, Bletchley provided confirmation that German High Command had fallen for the Allied deception plans, believing the main invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. Throughout the campaign in Europe, ultra-intelligence helped Allied commanders anticipate German movements and counterattacks. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later stated that the intelligence from Bletchley Park had been of priceless value and saved countless British and American lives. Churchill, one of the few political leaders fully briefed on Bletchley's work, told King George VI that the Codebreakers were the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. Yet when victory came in 1945, the women of Bletchley faced an abrupt return to civilian life, with no recognition of their extraordinary service. The facility was disbanded, its records sealed, its equipment destroyed. Participants were reminded of their secrecy oaths, which remained binding. Many returned to traditional domestic roles or resumed interrupted careers, unable to list their most significant wartime achievements on resumes or explain gaps in their employment history. Jean Valentine, who operated the bombs, recalled, "We weren't allowed to talk about it. If anyone asked what we did in the war, we were told to say we were doing clerical work for the Foreign Office." And eventually people stopped asking. The secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park remained absolute until the 1970s, when the first books revealing its existence began to appear. Even then, many veterans maintained their silence out of ingrained habit. It wasn't until 1975 that the work was officially declassified, and only in recent decades have the full contributions of the women of Bletchley received proper attention. For many female veterans, recognition came too late. Sarah Baring, who worked as a decoder, noted, "By the time our work was made public, most of us were either very old or had died. We never had a chance to tell our families exactly what we had done." The historical obscurity of these women reflects broader patterns in how women's contributions to war efforts are remembered. While male combat roles received immediate public recognition, women's work, even when intellectually demanding and directly impacting military outcomes, was often minimized or forgotten. Beyond historical justice, recognizing the women of Bletchley Park matters for understanding how diverse talents contribute to national security and technological innovation. The code-breaking operation demonstrated that intellectual challenges benefit from diverse approaches. Some women excelled at spotting statistical anomalies, others at linguistic nuances, still others at maintaining the mechanical systems that supported the cryptanalytic work. The legacy of these women extends beyond their direct contribution to Allied victory. Many innovations in computing trace their lineage to Bletchley Park. The Colossus machines, primarily operated by women, pioneered electronic computing concepts that influenced subsequent development. Women like Joyce Aylard, who operated Colossus, were programming computers before programming was recognized as a distinct profession. In post-war years, some Bletchley women built on their classified experiences to make significant contributions to emerging computer science. Others applied their analytical skills to fields from economics to literature. Yet many carried their secret quietly, their greatest achievement known only to themselves until late in life. Anne Mitchell, née Williamson, who worked in Hut 6 breaking Army and Air Force Enigma, didn't tell her husband about her wartime work for 30 years. When documentation about Bletchley was finally published in the 1970s, she showed him a book with her name mentioned. "I always wondered what you did in the war," he said. "I knew it wasn't what you told me." These stories of ordinary women performing extraordinary work under conditions of absolute secrecy offer a powerful counter-narrative to traditional war stories. Without firing a shot, without public recognition, armed only with pencils, paper, and remarkable intellects, the women of Bletchley Park helped save their nation and shape the modern world. Their legacy reminds us that history happens not just on battlefields, but in quiet rooms where dedication, intelligence, and persistence can change the course of world events. As Jean Valentine reflected decades after her service, "We were just girls. We weren't trying to be heroes. We were just doing a job that needed to be done." The Sacred Band of Thebes, ancient Greece's elite gay warriors. The year is 371 BCE. On the blood-soaked fields of Leuctra, the unthinkable has happened. The seemingly invincible Spartan phalanx, the military machine that has dominated Greek warfare for nearly 3 centuries, lies broken. Among the Spartan dead is their king, Cleombrotus, along with 400 of their elite citizens and 600 more warriors. It is the first time in recorded history that Sparta has been decisively defeated in a pitched battle, when not heavily outnumbered. The architects of this stunning upset? A small city-state called Thebes, led by its revolutionary sacred band, 300 elite warriors organized into 150 pairs of male lovers. This unique military unit not only transformed Greek warfare, but also challenges our modern assumptions about the relationship between sexuality, masculinity, and military prowess in the ancient world. The Sacred Band story illuminates a fascinating aspect of Greek civilization, often simplified or misunderstood: the complex interplay between same-sex relationships and martial valor in a society where concepts of sexuality differed radically from our own. More than just a historical curiosity, the Sacred Band represents one of history's most successful military experiments, a force that remained undefeated for nearly 4 decades until facing the revolutionary army of Philip II of Macedon and his son, Alexander the Great. To understand this extraordinary military unit, we must first understand the world that created it. Ancient Greece was not a unified nation, but a collection of independent city-states, or polis, each with its own government, laws, and military. 2 powers had traditionally dominated: Athens with its formidable navy, and Sparta with its legendary infantry. By the early 4th century BCE, these traditional powers were weakened after decades of conflict in the Peloponnesian War and subsequent struggles. Into this power vacuum stepped Thebes, a Boeotian city previously overshadowed by its more famous neighbors. The Thebans had long been stereotyped by Athenians as backward and uncultured, the Boeotian swine, in contemporary insults. But military and political innovations would soon transform this underdog into Greece's preeminent power. The sacred band was formed around 378 BCE under the leadership of the brilliant General Gorgidas. What made this force revolutionary wasn't just its composition of male couples, but how it strategically leveraged existing cultural institutions and beliefs about love, honor, and courage. Greek society, particularly among the aristocratic warrior class, had long practiced what scholars call institutionalized pederasty, formalized relationships between older men, erastes, and younger males, eromenos, who had reached adolescence but not yet adulthood. These relationships were educational and sexual, designed to initiate young men into the aristocracy while creating bonds between generations of the citizen warrior class. The Theban innovation was to formalize and systematize these relationships into a permanent fighting force of 300 men, drawn from the city's elite families. Unlike other Greek units, where soldiers might be motivated primarily by civic duty or fear of dishonor, the sacred band added another dimension, the intense personal bond between each pair of warriors. As Plutarch, writing centuries later, explained, "A band that is held together by the friendship between lovers is indissoluble and not to be broken, since the lovers are ashamed to play the coward before their beloved, and the beloved before their lovers, and both stand firm in danger to protect each other." The psychological dynamics of this arrangement were powerful. In traditional Greek phalanx warfare, the primary fear was not of death, but of shame, appearing cowardly before one's comrades. The sacred band doubled this motivation. No warrior would retreat and leave his beloved vulnerable, nor would he behave in any way that might diminish him in his lover's eyes. The exact composition of these pairs is subject to scholarly debate. While Plutarch's account suggests an older-younger dynamic consistent with traditional pederastic relationships, other evidence indicates that by the time of the sacred band's greatest victories, it may have included adult men of similar ages, bound by both erotic and emotional attachment. What's clear is that these were not casual relationships. Members of the sacred band lived and trained together at state expense in the Cadmea, Thebes' acropolis. They developed specialized tactics that maximized their unit cohesion and fighting prowess. While traditional Greek hoplite warfare relied on mass formations, where individual relationships between soldiers were secondary to overall unit discipline, the sacred band emphasized the paired relationship as its fundamental tactical unit. The band's first major test came shortly after its formation, during conflicts with Sparta in the early 370 BCE. Initial engagements demonstrated their effectiveness, but it was under the leadership of the brilliant general and statesman Epaminondas that they would revolutionize Greek warfare. Epaminondas recognized that the traditional Greek phalanx, a rectangular formation typically 8 to 12 men deep, had tactical limitations, particularly against Sparta's superior training. Rather than confronting Spartan strength directly, he developed asymmetric formations that concentrated force at specific points. At Leuctra, in 371 BCE, he positioned the sacred band on the left wing of the Theban army and deepened the formation to an unprecedented 50 ranks. This innovation allowed the sacred band, led by their commander Pelopidas, to smash into the Spartan right wing, where the Spartans traditionally placed their best troops, including their king. The shocked Spartans, facing a concentrated force of elite warriors driven by personal bonds as well as patriotism, broke for the first time in their storied military history. The psychological impact of this victory was seismic. Sparta, whose very name had inspired terror throughout Greece, had been beaten in a fair fight. The mystique of Spartan invincibility was shattered forever. In the aftermath, Thebes emerged as Greece's dominant power, liberating territories previously under Spartan control and reorganizing the political map of central Greece. For nearly a decade after Leuctra, the sacred band participated in campaigns throughout Greece, remaining undefeated and building a reputation as the most formidable fighting force of their time. Their successes allowed Thebes to briefly establish a hegemony over much of mainland Greece, a remarkable achievement for a city previously considered a second-tier power. The personal relationship between commanders Epaminondas and Pelopidas, likely not romantic partners themselves, but close comrades who understood the band's psychology, proved crucial to these successes. When Pelopidas was killed in battle in 364 BCE, Epaminondas reportedly grieved deeply for his friend. When Epaminondas himself fell at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, Theban power began a gradual decline, though the sacred band itself remained elite. What made the sacred band so effective went beyond their loving relationships. Though these were central to their ethos, they received the best equipment the city could provide, including distinctive shields, possibly emblazoned with the club of Heracles, the mythical hero particularly revered in Thebes. Their training was rigorous and continuous, combining traditional hoplite discipline with wrestling and other athletic pursuits that Greeks associated with both military preparation and erotic display. The philosophical underpinnings of the sacred band reflected sophisticated thinking about love and courage. Contemporaneous Greek philosophers, particularly those influenced by Socratic thought, had developed theories about eros, romantic sexual love, as a motivating force for virtue and noble deeds. The sacred band institutionalized these philosophical concepts, creating a military force motivated by what Greeks considered the highest form of love, as Pamanes, a Theban commander, reportedly argued. Homer's Nestor was not well skilled in arranging an army when he advised the Greeks to rank tribe with tribe. He should have joined lovers and their beloved. For men of the same tribe little value one another when dangers press, but a band that is held together by the friendship between lovers is indissoluble and not to be broken. This perspective challenges modern assumptions that often associate military effectiveness with suppression of sexuality or emotional attachment. The sacred band demonstrated that properly channeled eros could create exceptional courage rather than compromise it. The band's final stand came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where the rising power of Macedon, under Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, confronted an alliance of Greek states trying to preserve their independence. The sacred band formed the elite core of the Theban contingent, facing Philip's revolutionary army with its longer spears and more flexible tactics. Against these innovations, even the sacred band's courage proved insufficient. Surrounded and outnumbered, the 300 warriors held their position while other Greek forces retreated. According to Plutarch, they stood their ground to the last man, dying where they had formed their line, each warrior falling beside his beloved. Archaeological evidence confirms this poignant account. In 1890, excavations near the Lion of Chaeronea, an ancient monument marking the battle site, uncovered a mass grave containing 254 skeletons arranged in 7 rows. The orderly burial, unusual for defeated enemies, suggests respect from Philip for his fallen adversaries. According to tradition, Upon viewing the sacred bands dead arranged in pairs, Philip wept and declared, "Perish miserably they who think that these men did or suffered anything disgraceful." Even Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer much of the known world, was said to have been moved by the sacred band's final stand. Though his own army would eclipse their fame, the legacy of these 300 warriors who preferred death to surrender or separation from their beloveds remained powerful in Greek cultural memory. The historical significance of the sacred band extends beyond their military accomplishments. They represent a unique moment when a society formally institutionalized same-sex bonds as a positive military asset, rather than a liability, a perspective that challenges both ancient and modern stereotypes about masculinity and combat effectiveness. Understanding the sacred band requires moving beyond simplistic parallels to modern concepts of sexual orientation. The Greeks did not categorize sexuality as homosexual or heterosexual. Such binary distinctions would have been foreign to their worldview. Rather, sexual desire was understood more in terms of roles, active, passive, age differences, and social status. Many Greek men who participated in same-sex relationships also married women and fathered children. What made the sacred band revolutionary was not that it included men who desired other men. This was commonplace in Greek aristocratic circles, but that it elevated these relationships from private practice to state institution, formally recognizing the military potential of erotic bonds between warriors. This recognition reflected broader Theban cultural attitudes. Unlike Athens, which had a complex and sometimes contradictory approach to same-sex relationships, or Sparta, which institutionalized them primarily as part of the agoge training system, Thebes appears to have more thoroughly integrated male couples into its civic ideology. Some scholars connect this to Theban origin myths involving same-sex couples and their patron deity Heracles, who had male lovers in some traditions. The sacred band also offers insights into ancient Greek military psychology. While modern armies typically emphasize unit cohesion, built through shared training and identity, the sacred band explored how more intimate personal bonds might motivate exceptional courage. Their success suggests that, at least in the context of ancient infantry combat, the fear of appearing cowardly before a beloved provided powerful motivation. The story of the sacred band challenges our tendency to view history through contemporary lenses. Modern Western militaries have historically regarded homosexuality as incompatible with military service. The United States' "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy was only repealed in 2011. Yet here was an elite military unit organized explicitly around same-sex couples that dominated the battlefield for decades. This historical contradiction prompted philosopher Michel Foucault to observe that the sacred band represented an army of lovers that was also an army of the best citizens, a fusion of erotic attachment and civic virtue that modern societies have often treated as incompatible. The archaeological evidence from Cheronia provides a poignant epilogue to the sacred band's story. The 254 skeletons, buried with honors by their conquerors, were found with their weapons and characteristic bronze belt buckles still in place. They had indeed died as they had lived, together, facing impossible odds with courage derived from their bonds to each other and their city. In death, as in life, the sacred band of Thebes defied conventional expectations. They proved that love between men could be harnessed not just for individual heroism, but for strategic military advantage. They demonstrated that a smaller city-state with innovative social and military organization could overturn centuries of established power dynamics. And perhaps most significantly, they showed that history's reality is often more complex and surprising than our retrospective categories suggest. As we continue to debate the relationship between sexuality, gender, and military service in contemporary societies, the Sacred Band reminds us that these questions have deep historical roots, and that the answers civilizations have found are more diverse than we might assume. These 300 warriors who loved, fought, and died together left a legacy that transcends their brief military dominance. A testament to the unexpected ways human societies have organized themselves, and the remarkable courage that can emerge when love and duty align rather than conflict.